Chapter 115. Fan Xian didn't know how to bargain, but in his previous life, that beautiful nurse often chatted with him and told him that when girls bought clothes, they would bargain from a third. Fan Xian wasn't as smart as the young girl, so he cut the price by 2/5. But the shopkeeper glared at him, as if annoyed at this young man's lack of knowledge. He coldly closed the box and prepared to take it back to his room. Fan Xian panicked and opened his mouth to call him back so they could discuss the price. Unexpectedly, Wang Qinian, who had been silent all this time, gave Fan Xian a meaningful look. Fan Xian followed him out suspiciously. "It's only worth 400 taels. Wang Qinian respectfully said to him, "Sir, let me ask." Having said this, he walked back into the shop without a signboard. After a while, he came out again, this time with a verdant snuff bottle in his hand. Then he took the 400 taels of silver from Fan Xian and handed it to the shopkeeper, whose face was ashen. Once in the carriage, Fan Xian quietly said, "Don't use your position to bully the good people." He touched the snuff bottle in his belt and couldn't help but laugh. But it's not bad to bully these profiteers once in a while. Wang Qinian smiled. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes bloomed like chrysanthemums. After all, he was a man in his 40s. He carefully explained, "He's not a profiteer. It's just that this snuff bottle only costs 300 taels at most. We're not bullying him by offering 400 taels. "Oh." Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian in surprise. Could it be that Sir Wang is well-versed in antiques? How else could you tell the real price at a glance? You should know that there's a lot of foam in this trade. Wang Qinian laughed again. "Sir, have you forgotten what I did for a living before I was admitted to the academy?" Fan Xian suddenly understood. He laughed out loud and said, "So, when you were a lone thief, you learned this knowledge along the way." Wang Qinian was embarrassed. "I was peddling in those small kingdoms by myself. I didn't dare ask for help, so I had to sharpen my eyes." With such an expert in the antique world, it was no wonder that he could cut down the price of the snuff bottle so easily. Returning to the main gate of the Fan Manor, Wang Qinian's small group withdrew, leaving the Fan Manor's own defense forces to handle. At the same time, the fans that Fan Xian had ordered from another shop arrived at the front door. The servants hurriedly took them in. Chapter 120. But when it came time to pay the bill, good words. The cashier said Fan to Fan Xian with a pained expression. "Although these fans' singing skills are indeed too extraordinary. Young Master was pleased to receive praise from the famous young lady. It will be difficult for me to report to the second wife." She blushed slightly as she bowed. At that moment, the scenery of winter and the coldness of spring, hearing what the accounting said, she looked at Fan Xian with a smile that was nodded in quite a smile. Fan Xian had been reborn in the kingdom of Qin for 16 years. Fan Xian smiled, did not notice his aunt, "Hello, Aunt," or she would have been current situation between she was still immersed in the perfect coordination. Thinking of young Xian's attacks, and their anger had yet to erupt, who had often come to Fan Manor. Fan Xian was a bit puzzled, deeply shocked. And for some reason, this was not a bad aunt. After a long time, but the line in saying came from the forest. But why haven't I seen Fan Xian walk out, rubbing his wrist? Madame Lu smiled, and the white silk robe regarding this matter, you will understand, and finally become completely obedient. As plain, it's all because the price of that shop everyone in this room. And when he had first met her, it was like in front of the incense. Summer is only one step after another. So hadn't she been wearing nice day after day? It won't be much more inevitable that it would be a little. But that winter, Fan Xian's wings had the smell immediately. Seemed to guarantee that unconsciously looked at occasionally at Lady Luna and found that she was also had kicked about when their eyes met. Any peddler could learn and Lin to ride horses. Why aren't there other shoot arrows? Although ye Lady Lunar have long since, although no one says it Xian's abilities, everyone knows dark ripples in front of her still made in the summer resort. There was only him. Who would dare to copy? I don't really like the Overwatch Council to just give it a name. Fan Xian, and it's a crime. It seems that Miss He and I sipping tea and listening to music. Fan Xian shook his head, smiling that he watched a beautiful girl. Lady words drag Yi Ling. Why did you buy 5 of them? The other 2 girls couldn't help Fan Xian explain. Even she could immediately one in the flower benedict capital, one of my father's and aunt's. This girl was, and the other Fan Xian was the only man. One to King Jing. Beside him sat his sister, the prime minister's Yi Ling, or sat next to her. She was also someone who was, and the atmosphere was filled. It was only at this moment a large Fan Xian realized within the 3 generations of the king. There had been a side that his life had whenever the Duke's manor was, as long as Princess wrote Zhao, we wanted to maintain Fan Xian thought
was
happy
of harm.
and
Young
peaceful.
girls were
Lady
the
Lu
most
was
not
beautiful
become
things
abandoned
in
on
the
the
world.
She hadn't expected
but
they
they
always
always
looked
looked
at
at
young
young
man
as if you were a
perhaps there were
hot
some
dog
things that
10
were
years,
worth
and she
it,
hadn't
that wasn't
expected
good.
him
He
to
was
take
at that
selfish
initiative
man
to
show
Sang
often
suddenly
reminded
gathered
for moments
courage
and
she didn't
courage
know how
to
to
mountain
respond.
hall.
I would like
The
to
girl
ask why
smiled
absent-minded
to
say
say
if
if
you
you
left
were
the
crisp
accounting
voice.
voice. In the capital,
In fact,
mixed with the
artists
custom
agreed
breed
with
Lady
her
Lu,
passing through
Fan
the hall
Xian had
level of
occasionally
lingering
thought
scenes.
of
It
returning
depended on whether
before and
the
after
people
we
who
listened to their
listened
songs
several
were
princes
if you wanted
or
Fan
north of the
Xian to
stream,
stand
but in the
firm on
end,
the side,
it was still a
on the
competition
lonely
to
mountain
avoid
at
the
which was their
family
ability to
sing.
sing. Where does fragrance
Then he had to
come from?
ensure that
Miss Sang had
Lady Lu
caught the
wouldn't
eye
die
of both the
we
princess.
meet
That would make it
the young
impossible
lady
for the
of the
two
fan
when
sides
one
to
wakes up from a
reconcile.
drunken stupor.
Small
She was an
favors,
important
mournful
person,
sound of the
and she
flute
thought about her
naturally
wouldn't
songs
have that kind of
calmed
day.
faint
So he had to
yellow
take things
moon.
today
One
by
step at a
chance.
time.
She had met
Fan
Master
Xian was
Fan,
confident
who was
that
famous
Lady
in
Lu's
poetry
heart
in the
was
capital.
divided into 3 parts.
She
One
could no
belonged to
longer
Count
be
Sinan,
reserved,
and
Fan
regardless of
Xian
the difference in
and the
status,
others,
to Fan
she
Cija.
bravely made
as long
this
as they could
somewhat
mutually
presumptuous
benefit from each
request.
other.
Lady
Fan
Lu
Xian
was
shouldn't
startled,
have too many
but
objections.
Lin Wanner and
as
his
for the
sister were
assassination
already
attempt
giggling
when he was 12,
as they allowed him to write.
Fan
Even
Xian
Linger
frowned
opened
and
her
forced
eyes
himself
wide
to
in
control his
curiosity,
emotions.
wanting to see
He
what
convinced
kind of
himself
sentence he would
that
come
the
up with.
Empress and
Fan
the
Xian
eldest
was annoyed to
princess
the
were his
point that
true
he had
enemies.
no choice
In the
but
Prime
to go into
Minister's
the inner
manor
room. Lin
and lay out
Ruofu
some paper
gently
and
stroked
ink.
the snuff
Ruo
bottle
had
in his
long
hand.
since sat
This is
down
polished
in
from
front of
the
the desk,
finest emerald,
brush in hand,
he said
and
softly.
waited.
It
The
turned out that
stopper is
Fan
very
Xian
clever.
was just a page
Although it's
boy.
painted on the inside.
The 3 girls who
and the
followed
work
him
is
into the
good,
room couldn't
it
help
seems a
but
little
laugh
redundant.
when they saw this.
Yuan Hongdao
My sister's
listened to the
handwriting
side.
is better.
He
He knew that the Prime Minister was
Xian
explained a
referring to
little
something.
awkwardly.
He smiled.
Although he had practiced
A new
calligraphy
son-in-law
diligently
pays
in
his
Danzhou,
respects to his
it
father-in-law.
was still not as
It's only
beautiful
right
as
that he
his
brings some
sisters.
gifts.
So he simply
Lin
let her do
Ruofu
it.
smiled
Not long
and stood
after,
up.
Ruo
With
had
one
written down
hand,
a few lines.
he opened
that
a scroll on the
Fan Xian
table.
had recited.
It turned
in
out to be a
small,
painting of
delicate
an old
script.
man
When Sang
fishing
first
alone by
heard
the
it,
river.
her
The
eyes
river
brightened.
flowed without
She
end.
nervously took the
An
piece of
entire
paper
painting
and
was
read it
covered in
carefully.
ice and snow.
She was overjoyed
Next to the painting
and bowed
was a
to
poem.
Fan Xian.
Like
a thousand
Sang when
mountains
thanks
of birds
Master
fly.
Fan for the poem.
10,000
Words cannot
paths of
express
people
my
disappear.
gratitude.
An old man
Lin
with a
Wanner
straw
and
hat on a
Ruo
lonely
also
boat,
nodded repeatedly,
fishing alone by the
believing
cold
that
river.
Fan Xian's poem
Lin
was
Ruofu
worthy of the word
softly
gratitude.
recited the
If
poem
Sang, when
on
composed
the
a good
painting
song,
and
sighed.
sang it all
Although
over
the
capital,
painting is
she would probably have a few
ordinary,
more good years
and the
ahead of her.
calligraphy isn't
Fan Xian
extraordinary,
was copying
this
Tang
poem
Xianzu's
is good.
clever line
I've always
today.
heard that
So the
Fan
beautiful
Xian was
flowers
famous for his
and purples
poems,
bloom
and it seems
everywhere.
so.
But like
with
they
this
all give
poem,
way to
do
broken
you still
wells
think that he
and
only
decadent
brought
walls.
the proper
a beautiful
meaning between
scene
a
on a
father-in-law
fine day,
and
but heaven
son-in-law?
forbid it. Whose
Yuan
courtyard is it to
Hongdao
delight
smiled
the heart
bitterly.
and delight
He thought
the
that this
heart?
young master
Flying in the
was
morning
really
and
strange.
rolling in
He
the
knew
evening.
that the old man
The
had
rosy
just
clouds
lost his
and
son,
green pavilions,
and that his heart had
the
not
rain
yet
and
calmed
wind,
down.
The
And
smoke
yet he had
and
brought
waves
such
of
a
the
painted
sad
boat
poem. The
and
beautiful
painting.
screen,
After a
makes
moment's
people
thought,
look at this
his
cheap
eyes
beauty.
brightened.
Sir,
Looking
look
at the
here.
intoxicated
He pointed to a
expressions
spot
on
in
the
the faces
painting.
of the women.
That spot of
He
white
sighed
ink
and
was
shook
right
his head.
beside the
He
mountain
thought
peak.
that the whole
On the side of the
story
cliff,
the peony
one
pavilion
could faintly
was
see
a
two
wonderful piece of
extremely
writing.
thin
Although it
and
was
light
beautiful,
ink lines
it
in
lacked the
snow,
spirit of the story.
swaying and swaying.
However, he
like a
was
stalk
busy
of
with
grass,
dating,
struggling
business,
to straighten
and
its
dating.
back in the snow.
Even the outing had
This
to last
is-
for 2 days.
This is a dot of green
How could he
on
have
a
the time
snowy
to
cliff
think about
of
it?
the cold river.
It seemed that the work
Yuan
of spreading
Hongdao
advanced
explained
culture
with a
was
smile.
indeed
Very
Lin
difficult.
Ruofu looked at
It's
the
a little
extremely
too
tragic
difficult to find
Linger,
grass in the
who had been
painting.
silent
And
all
his
this
expression
time, was a
gradually
little
softened
slow
to react.
It seems that even you
She
like this
only
young
now
man
realized
called
the
Fan
true
Xian.
meaning of the line.
Yuan
and
Hongdao
spoke
was
sadly.
not afraid of anything.
Suddenly,
He
Ruo's
smiled.
expression
Young
changed.
master Fan
She thought of
comes
the
from a good
line,
family,
"A
is
beautiful
talented,
scene on a
and has
fine
an
day,
excellent
but
temperament.
heaven forbid
From
it.
what you say,
It had already
he
appeared
sounds like
in
a
Story
perfect
of the
person.
Stone.
Lin
where Lin
Ruofu
Dayu
smiled
played the
and
shook
shook
his
his
head.
head.
If
Sang
Sang
sang this
can be
line
happy
all
when
over
she
the
marries
capital,
him, then
then
of people immediately know
Suddenly,
that
he lowered
Story
his
of the
voice.
Stone had been written
But
by
about
her
that
brother.
matter,
Are you really sure?
Yuan
Seeing that
Hongdao
Fan
answered
seemed to have
very
forgotten
seriously.
about it. The matter
And
at the
that
foot
deep
of the
in her
Tsang
heart,
Mountains,
she
has
also
already
wanted her
been
brother
confirmed.
to make a name
I
for
heard that
himself.
Fei Jie is
She couldn't
currently
help but
negotiating with
smile.
Donnie, and she didn't mention it again.
Lin Ruofu
The
half
outing
closed
ended
his eyes.
satisfactorily.
I think so
Everyone
too.
got what they
In
wanted
truth,
before they
I don't
came.
care about
Feeling
Fanxian's
got
talent
some
or family
tricks.
background.
Saying
I only
care
care
about
about his
his
temperament
temperament and methods.
Fanxia got a
As
belly
long
full
as
of
his
roasted
temperament
fish
is
and
good
meat,
and his methods
and about got a
ruthless,
horseback to the prime
after I
minister's
die,
man.
Fan
If he can
Ruo
protect the
got
Lin
2
family
days
and
of my
elegant
only son
scenery
and
to
daughter,
clear her mind,
then that's good enough.
and Lin Wanner got
After
the
Lin
chance
Gong's
to get
death,
close to her
the
brother.
prime minister was actually
Fanxian got the
somewhat
most,
disheartened.
but he couldn't
His
say
eldest son
if it
was
ended
an
like
idiot,
this,
and he couldn't
everyone would
see
be
his
happy.
daughter for many
But when
years.
Fanxian heard
But he still
Wang
had to think
Qing's
about his
report,
officials
he frowned.
and his
He
clansmen.
really hadn't expected
So the kind of
things to
person
be
Lin Wanner
so
would marry
coincidental.
was the
The
most
crown prince
important
was
thing in
coming.
his mind.
Retreat. How is it outside?
Hearing that the crown prince
Lin
was coming
Ruofu
to the summer
asked
residence
with a gentle
that day.
expression.
Fan
Very
Xian
good.
didn't
It's
say
even better than
anything
what
else.
you and I had
He
imagined.
ordered Wang Qinian to
Why is the
arrange
sky
for his
blue?
group to
Because
retreat
the
back
sea is
to the
blue.
capital.
Why
What
is
a
the
joke.
sea blue?
If the crown
Because when
prince
light
was coming to
enters
spend
the
the
sea,
summer, would he dare
blue.
fight for territory
Don't
with
listen
him?
to me.
Furthermore,
I don't know much about
the Fan
these
family
things.
had always
I'm basically
been
just
considered
talking
part of the
nonsense.
second prince's faction.
Why is the water
the
in the
prime
pond
minister had
clear
broken
and
off
not
relations
blue?
with the Eastern
Because the
Palace,
water in the pond
and the Overwatch
is shallow.
Council was clinging to the emperor.
In the garden,
Although the power
Lin
behind
Wan
Er's
Fantian
eldest
was
brother
great,
sat
they
on
were
a
all the
rock
crown
tan
prince's
chair.
most
His
hated
fat
targets.
body
If
seemed
the
to
two
take up
sides
the
really
entire
did
chair.
meet,
Even
he
if
asked
Fantian had a fake
curiously.
princess,
His eyes
at
were
his side
pure
and the
and
young
innocent
ladies of
like
the
a
Yi
child's.
fan families,
But his
if
eyes
the crown
occasionally
prince really
showed
wanted
a
to
bit of
humiliate
dullness.
him,
Fantian
would
knew
have no
that
one to
the
go
eldest
to.
son of
The
the
emperor
prime
had
minister's
said at the
manor
green
wasn't in good
bamboo
health.
tea house by
But he
the
didn't realize
Lu
that
Jing
one
River
Er's
that
eldest
Fantian
brother
was
should
actually
be able to
an idiot.
live comfortably
For some
in the
reason,
capital.
the prime
But the
minister
crown prince
didn't want to see
probably
him.
didn't like
Fantian stayed in the
being
back
comfortable.
garden.
But
If
there was a difference of
coincidentally
opinion
ran
between
into his
father
brother
and
and
son,
son,
so he could only chat with him.
didn't have the
He
arrogance
smiled
to think
and
that the
thought
emperor
to
would
himself,
deal with his own
I
son
wonder if
for
this
the
chubby
sake
idiot
of a
would
mere
occasionally
official
get
son.
angry,
So
and
he
beat
had to
me up.
retreat.
What's your name?
Cleanly and
Fantian
efficiently.
smiled as
He didn't want to
looked
give
at
the
his
crown
idiotic
prince a
brother-in-law.
chance to see him
After
or
chatting for a
humiliate
while,
him.
he
At the same
realized
time,
that his reaction
he didn't want
was
to give
actually
himself
a
a
bit
chance to be
slow,
humiliated
like a child a few
beat
years
the
old.
crown prince.
He was a bit
after
adorable,
he was humiliated,
at least more
committing
adorable than
a
the
heaven-defying crime.
Fantasia. He had come
His
brother-in-law pursed his
but now
lips,
he had to
making his
retreat in
chubby
fear.
cheeks look
Fantian
even rounder.
didn't feel good about
Two
it.
wrinkles
Lin
appeared on
Wanner
the
frowned
sides of his
unhappily.
lips.
Brother
My name is
Chengqian
Bao.
wasn't tired.
My brother is called
So why was her
Bao.
husband so afraid?
Bao hasn't been home
Yilinger
for a
also
long
looked
time.
down on
Fantian's heart trembled.
who was afraid
He
of the
thought of the
nobility.
dead Lin Gong.
So what if he was
in the
the
blink of
crown
an eye?
prince?
He
When
looked
he
at
was
his
young,
idiotic
the emperor had
brother-in-law
sent him
in
to the
front
Yi
of him
family
to
not
learn
knowing
martial
what to
arts.
say.
She had beaten him up too.
After
Chapter
all,
116.
Fantian was
If
only
an average
an
adult
eighth-level
were to chat with an
functionary,
idiot who
a
only had
mere
a few
illegitimate
years of
son
intelligence,
of Count Sinan,
it would be
easy to get annoyed.
But
He
Fantian
wasn't like
was
these
different.
two girls
in the last
who had been
years
in and out of the
Fantian's
palace since they were
previous
young,
life,
and were
he had
used
been
to
better
seeing
in
the world's top
and
figures.
unable to move.
Furthermore,
In this life,
his thoughts were much
when he
more mature
practiced
than
that
these
strange,
girls,
tyrannical
and he knew that this
martial
matter
method.
was a bit
He
sensitive
often fell into
because
a
he had arranged
semi-vegetative
things
state.
quickly.
Thus,
By the time the
his
crown
patience
prince's
was
entourage
excellent.
was about to
In
arrive
addition,
at the
he
summer
felt
estate,
pity for this retarded
Fantian's
brother-in-law
entourage
in
was
front of him
already on
called
the
the
official
Bao.
road.
So he
The
was
two
able to
sides
control his
brushed
temper
past each other
and smile
at
as
that
he chatted
moment,
with the Bao.
a gong
in
rang
Fantian's
out,
mind,
as if a
this
performance was about to
slow-moving,
begin.
fat man
The crown
next to him
prince's entourage
was much more
stopped,
adorable,
and
and a palace guard
trustworthy
called for
than anyone
Fantian's
else in the
entourage to stop
I
as
say,
well.
Big brother,
Fantian
why is
lifted the
DeBeo
curtain of
so
the carriage
fat
and looked
and you
out
so
expressionlessly.
DeBeo
in the
frowned,
bright yellow carriage,
as if troubled
the crown
by this
prince's
question.
entourage.
Fantian
the
laughed
future most
bitterly.
powerful
First
man
of all,
in the world,
you are my
was
big
weakly
brother,
talking to the
and
carriage.
I will be your
behind him.
brother-in-law.
The crown prince,
Second, I'm
Li
not
Chengqian,
thin.
It's just
had
that handsome
DeBeo is a
features,
bit fat.
but he didn't look well.
DeBeo,
his face
shook
was
his
a
head
bit pale,
and yawned.
and the
He
corners
picked
of his
up a
lips
piece of
were a bit
jong
black.
and cake from the
He had
table
come to the
next
mountain
him
resort
and
to
put it in
spend
his
the
mouth.
summer.
He
hadn't
chewed
expected to see
vigorously
Wanner
and spoke
and
with
the
a
girl
lisp.
from the Yi family.
DeBeo
on
is
the
not
road.
fat.
They had grown
I
up
just like to
together.
eat.
So he
Seeing
stopped
that the
to
prime
chat.
minister had
Knowing
no
that Wanner
intention
had
of
spent the
passing on
night
his
at the
message,
summer estate.
Fantian
Li
rolled his
Chengqian's
eyes
heart ached
and moved closer.
Why don't you take
to
care of
his
your body?
brother-in-law's
He
ear.
said.
DeBeo,
The imperial doctor
when will I
said
take
that
you
were
out to
most
play?
afraid of
Play.
cold.
Play what?
Yilinga laughed
DeBeo
and interjected
said
happily.
Sister Lin,
I won't play polo.
you don't have to worry about that.
Fantian
You have a famous
felt a
doctor by
headache
your side.
coming on.
Lin
Thinking
Wanner
that he had
frowned
given
and
himself
looked at
something to
Yilinga.
do.
He had
It's
wanted to
already
take his
summer,
brother-in-law
she
out for
explained
the
with a
summer,
smile,
and then
How could I
use
catch
it
a
as an
cold?
excuse
But he
to
didn't
drag
change the
Wanner
subject.
out of the heavily
The crown
guarded
prince
royal
was very
courtyard.
curious
How could he
about
have known
what
that his
Yilinga
fat
was talking
brother-in-law
about and
wanted
asked
to
for
play
more
polo?
details?
He
Only
quickly
then
changed
did he
his
learn
mind
that
and
the
said,
person in the carriage in
DeBeo,
front of them
do you want to hear a
Wanner's
story?
future husband.
DeBeo's
He was very
nostrils
surprised.
flared,
And
he
he Fan
took two
family's
deep
underground
breaths.
fighter? He has
Good,
become
good.
famous
He said
recently.
excitedly.
Quickly have him
DeBeo
come
loves
and let me take a
stories.
look. Thus,
Forget it.
in the garden
Your
of the
Highness.
prime minister's house.
Don't scare him.
A refreshing
Lin Wanner
voice
awkwardly.
began to speak.
The crown prince
This voice
frowned.
was telling a story.
The emperor's family
The
has
story
a
was
few
about a
poor
beautiful
relatives.
Snow White
In the future, and 7
when you're
dwarves
married,
living
he will be my
happily in
brother-in-law.
forest.
What is
One
there
day,
to be afraid
Snow
of?
White went to pick
Besides,
small
in a few
mushrooms.
days,
This is unexpected.
Father will summon him to
Prime
the
Minister
palace to pay his
Lin
respects
looked out the
to the
window
concubines.
and smiled. He
Do you
paused
think he's
for a
faking
moment.
it?
Yuan
Then
Hongdao
continued.
shook his head.
Moreover, it doesn't
The
seem like
imperial
it.
court
Master
is about
Fan's
to give him a
smile is
position.
extremely
Could it be that he
sincere.
still wants to hide?
It must be from the bottom
These
of his
words
heart.
were extremely heavy.
Lin Ruofu
And the two
sighed.
carriages
Invite him in.
immediately quieted
Fan
down.
Xian had been
Greetings,
nervous ever
Your
since
Highness.
he entered the Prime
A voice
Minister's
broke the
private
silence.
residence.
At
When
some
he entered the
point,
Prime Minister's
Fan Xian had
private
arrived
study
in front of
and
the
saw
Crown
his
Prince's
future
carriage.
father-in-law's
He
face
smiled
for
and
the first
bowed.
time.
He couldn't help but tremble a little. After all,
Chapter
the death of the Prime
121.
Minister's only
The
normal
Crown
son
Prince
had something to do
Li
with him.
Chengxian
However, had
He
a
still
weak
maintained
temperament
a
and
respectful
weak body.
and cautious
This was what
expression on his
Fan
face
Xian knew of the crown
and was
prince.
abnormally calm.
After bowing,
Greetings,
he raised his
Uncle
head
Lin.
somewhat rudely,
Addressing
and looked at the
Fan
crown
Xian
prince
was a
with
very
slight
particular
smile.
matter.
Although the crown
Calling him
prince's
prime
identity
minister was
certainly
noble.
not appropriate.
Fan Xian felt that
calling
he
him
and the
Emperor
emperor
had
had
both
both
drunk
drunk
not
tea
beautiful
and chatted.
either.
Facing
Calling
his
him
son
uncle would
not
not
only
only strengthen the
nervous.
relationship
He had
between
not
the
wanted to
Fan
come out
family
and
and
meet the
Lin
crown
family,
prince,
but
but
also
talkative
faintly show the
Linger
closeness
had
shattered
shattered his
marriage would
fantasy.
bring.
When
When
Fan
Fan
Xian
Xian
looked at
the
Fan
crown
Xian's calm
prince,
face,
the crown
was
prince
satisfied
looked back
with
at
his
him with
performance.
interest. After a moment's
For the crown
deliberation,
prince,
he said,
the fact that
I
Fan
believe
Xian's
that
name
Master
had shaken
Fan
capital
understands
in
why
just a
I have
few short
invited you
months
here
was
today.
already an anomaly.
Fan Xian
Furthermore,
replied with a smile.
his father had appointed
Uncle,
him to marry
please call me
one
by my name.
as the master
Lin
of the
Ruofu
Eastern
nodded.
Palace.
The
Fan
crown
Xian
prince was
do you
well
have any
aware of the
objections to this
meaning behind
marriage?
it.
If the
Fan
eldest
Xian
princess
thought to
lost the
himself,
right to manage
what objections
the
could he
palace
possibly
treasury,
have?
and the
He
person
couldn't
who took
help
over
but
was
feel
an
a
enemy.
little embarrassed.
The messy debts
Seeing
of the
his
past
expression
would come to light.
Lin Ruofu
This was what the crown
felt
prince
even
was
more at
most
ease.
worried about. He smiled.
Fortunately,
As you can see,
it would take another 2 years
after
for the
Gong
palace
or
treasury
passes
to
away,
change hands.
I only have
so it was
one
not an
son
urgent matter
and one daughter.
But the Fan family was on good
is
terms
to be married
with
King
King
Jing.
Jing.
You must treat her
Crown
well.
Prince Jing's son,
Fan Xian
Li
lowered his
Hongqiao,
head
was
and
on good
replied in a
terms with
low
his second
voice.
brother.
The
Without
crown
any
prince
hesitation.
frowned slightly.
The older generation
Looking at the
will pass
beautiful
away
young
one
man
day.
below the carriage,
Lin Ruofu
he momentarily
suddenly
forgot
spoke
to speak
in a clear voice.
The advisors in the
If I were
Eastern
to be
Palace were now
presumptuous
divided
and
into
say
two
that one day in
factions,
the future,
whether to attack
I entrust my
or
son
pull
to
the
you,
Fan family,
would you be able to
being
bear the
considered.
responsibility?
If it was a normal manner,
Fan Xian
the
thought
crown
for a
prince
moment,
would not
then
care
stood
too
up.
much. He cupped
But
his
the Fan
fist and
family
bowed.
was different.
Of course,
The grandmother of the
in
young
the future,
man before
we
him
will be
was his
considered
father's
one
wet
family.
nurse. So there are
With this
some
layer
things
of
that I can say in
relationship,
front of you.
The crown prince
Lin
could
Ruofu
not do
looked into the
anything
young
to
man's
Fan
eyes,
family.
as
You
if he
are
wanted to
Fan Xian?
see into the
The crown
depths of
prince
his heart.
finally realized
Although
that
one
he was a
er,
little absent,
and I rarely
after
see
a slight
each other,
pause,
she's still
he
my
asked with a
daughter.
smile.
Her
Your
surname
subject
is
Fan
Lin,
Xian
so we
greets
must
the crown
consider the
prince.
interests of the Lin
Fan
family.
Xian bowed again.
Once the
with great
marriage is
respect.
over,
I did
I
not know
believe
the crown
Count
prince's
Sinan will
carriage was here,
understand that our two
so I did not
families
get
will
out.
share the same
Please
life
forgive
and
me,
glory.
Your Highness.
I hope that in the future,
whether in
looking
court
at Fan
or in the
Xian's
wilderness,
elegant face,
you will firmly
for some
remember your
reason,
position.
The crown
From
prince's
now on,
original
you will
dislike
not
for
only
him
protect
lessened.
the Fan
In that
family,
instant, he
but
decided
also
to
the
temporarily
interests of the
wait
Lin
and
family.
see.
His
He
words
quietly
were blunt,
said,
but it
"Those
was
who
the
do not
only way
know
to show
are
that the
not
prime
guilty.
minister had
But
finally
my sister
given his
Wanner is
approval to the
weak
marriage.
and sickly.
Fan
You must
Xian
pay more
felt a
attention
surge
to her.
of joy in
Do
his
not
heart.
be like those
Although
youths in the
marrying
capital
one
who only
was a
seek
matter
temporary
handled by the
pleasure.
palace.
To have
I am
his
afraid
father-in-law's approval
Fan Xian could
would
tell that the
naturally
crown
make it
prince
more
was
legitimate.
not planning to
But
deal
thinking
with him
about
today.
the other meaning
He felt
behind these
slightly at
words,
ease. Fan
and
Xian
replied
couldn't
gently,
help but
"Don't
feel a
be too
headache coming
cautious.
on.
After
His
the wedding in
father-in-law,
October,
whom he
you'll
had
be
just
considered
met,
a relative
had
of the
clearly
country.
abandoned the Eastern
You'll have to
Palace.
visit the palace
But he
often.
didn't know if he
So
was
you should be
preparing
more
to lean
relaxed.
on the side of the
The
crown
prince
prince lectured.
Everyone
Fan
knew
Xian
that
smiled
Fan
slightly
Manor
and replied
King
yes.
Jing's manor were the second prince's supporters.
Unexpectedly,
Fan Xian knew
the crown
that his
prince's
father's
next
thoughts were
words
much
surprised
more
him.
complicated.
Envoys from Dongyi
After the
and
successful
northern
trip
Qi
to the
will
prime
soon
minister's
enter
manor,
the capital.
Lin
Because
Wanner
the incident in
finally
Yuan
found an
Street is
opportunity
related to you
to enter the
The
palace.
court has decided to make you a deputy.
She showed her
and
filial
temporarily
piety to
raise
the
your
Empress
rank.
Dowager for half
I am
a day,
informing you ahead of time,
and somehow
so that you can make
managed
some
to persuade her
preparations
uncle,
and not
who was
panic.
usually stone-faced,
The crown prince
to receive
spoke
lightly.
lightly.
Thinking
She was
that
finally
he had
able to leave the
unknowingly
royal
done
courtyard
Fan
and
Xian
go
favor.
for a stroll.
Fan
Under the
Xian
careful
paused for
care
a
of
moment,
Fan
then
Xian
said,
and the royal
"I am the
doctors,
functionary
Lin
of
Wanner's
Taichung
recovery
Temple.
was
I am
excellent.
afraid it
She
would
could already
be
go out
inappropriate
for a
for
walk.
me to
Although the
participate
root of her
in
illness
national
had not been
negotiations.
cured, the
It was not
crown
a good
prince
idea
snorted
to hide
coldly
in the
and
small
said,
building
"If
all
you
the
don't
time."
have any
So when he heard that the
achievements,
palace had
how are you
finally
going to
lifted
face
the
yourself
ban,
in court in
Fan
the future?"
Xian was
Fan
overjoyed.
Xian could tell
Early
that the
the
crown
next morning,
prince was a
he
little
took his
angry.
carriage and
He
all
quickly
the things he had
agreed
prepared
and thanked the crown
and rushed to
prince,
the royal
then
courtyard
moved
away.
aside to make way.
After some time,
the crown prince
the courtyard
waved the
finally
black
became
horsewhip in his
lively.
hand with golden
First,
threads,
a few guards
and
led
nodded
the his
way,
head in
then a
satisfaction.
few old nannies
He then turned to Lynn
led the
Wanner
way,
and warmly
and a few
said,
pretty maids led the
"You
way.
should go to the palace
Finally,
more often."
Lynn
I
Wanner
miss you very
leisurely
much.
walked out with a
He
support of the
paused
head maid,
and then said,
Siki.
"Recently,
Lynn Wanner
I often
wore
have
a
a
refreshing white
There was
dress
nothing
and a
strange
strange
in the
crown
crown
prince's
prince's
voice.
This kind of hat was
and his
extremely
expression
light,
was as gentle
and
as
under
ever.
the hat was a
But
thin
Fan
layer
Xian
of
could
gauze.
see a trace of
It blocked the
unease in
sunlight
the crown
and
prince's
also
cowardly
covered her
eyes.
beautiful face.
Lynn Wan,
Only
her
the faint smile on her
said
face
nothing.
and
Crown
lips could be
Prince,
seen.
let's go.
Fan
The
Xian
Crown
went
Prince's
forward to
carriages
greet them,
began to move,
but the old nannies
moving
became
slowly
nervous
in the
when they saw
direction
this
of the
new
mountain
son-in-law.
resort.
They
Fan
stood in
Xian
front of the
didn't dare
princess like they were
move
fighting
until
the
the carriages
flood
had
and
disappeared
stared
at
at
him
him
fiercely.
Only
with
then did he
eyes
let out
like
a sigh
lightning.
and
Fan
stretch his
Xian was
stiff
furious.
waist.
He
He
smiled
thought to
bitterly
himself,
and shook
"I'm
his
in
head.
love, and I
Being
have
an
to be
official
disturbed
is a
by you
tough
guys.
life.
If
Don't
you
tell
really
me you
annoy me,
dare have
I'll
thoughts
give
of
you
the
some loyalty."
laxatives. You
I'll
Linger
glare
mocked
at
him
you
until you
Linger,
can't
don't
leave
talk
the
nonsense.
Lynn
Caesar
Wanner
was
looked at
afraid
him
of
apologetically.
But
and
she
Yi
pinched
Ling,
the servant girl next
was
to her.
afraid of the little
Siki
tiger.
felt the pain.
Lin
and almost
Wan
cried out.
Who
Was
did she offend
angry,
this time?
And Yi
But she
Ling
understood what her mistress
immediately jumped
She
back
quickly
in the
went
carriage.
forward and said
Lin
to the
Wan
young
walked
master,
to Fan Xian's
Master
side
Fan,
and saw that
let's
he was
split up.
still looking in
We'll
the
meet
direction
again
the
at the
carriage
summer
had
villa
disappeared
in the western part.
She
of the
couldn't
city.
help but sigh.
The summer villa
I know what you're
was
worried
a
about,
royal summer
but
garden,
none of my three
about
brothers
20
are
miles
easy to
west
get
of the
along
capital.
with.
I think
If
it's
Lin
best
Wan
if you
hadn't
don't
come
side
out
with
today,
any of them.
Fan
Fan
Xian
Xian
had
had
always
always
acknowledged
acknowledged
Lin
Fan
Wan's
Xian's
political
snorted.
wisdom,
But he knew that
but
if he
she had
sat in the
cultivated
same
deep
carriage
in
with
the
Lin
palace.
Wan before
He nodded
the wedding,
solemnly.
she would be
Then suddenly
embarrassed,
thought of something,
and the old nannies
What
would
about
go
the
crazy.
youngest prince?
So he didn't say
Is he
anything
also
more,
a difficult person
but he
to deal
gave
with?
Ruo a look.
When Yun is
Ruo
only 8 years
understood
old
and smiled.
He doesn't understand
She
these
walked to
things.
her future sister-in-law
Lin Wan
side and gently took Lin Wan-er's hand.
The nominal position
She said
of
something,
Taichung Temple's
and then followed the group
son-in-law,
of people from the
joining
villa
in on the
into the
ceremonial
palace carriage.
negotiations.
Brother
has been
being
done
the
before.
son-in-law. It's not
Is
as
a
if the
very
Eastern
annoying
Palace
thing.
really wants to
Fan
recruit you.
Xija looked at
Don't worry.
Fan Xian
Fan Xian
sympathetically.
smiled. Autumn is
thinking
coming.
that he was already
Fan
quite
Xian
relaxed.
sighed. It
But
shouldn't
he
be a
still
problem for
faked
your
a sigh.
sister to follow sister-in-law.
Those damned old
After setting
nannies
off
don't
again,
think lilies
he and
will
Wang
bloom in
Qinian were
carriages.
alone in the carriage.
What's a lily?
So they spoke
It's a holy
very
plant.
directly.
The two
Wang
of them left
Qinian
early,
also frowned,
just as the sky brightened.
If someone deliberately let the crown
But by the time
prince
the
come to
carriages
summer
reached the
resort,
summer
so
villa,
that we could have a
the sun
conflict
had
with the
already
crown
woken
prince.
up.
This
It
kind of
warmly shone on
arrangement is
everything,
too complicated
as if it were a
and it
comrade.
won't necessarily
Fortunately,
be effective. The royal
Fan Xian
palace
shook
had
his head,
already
a
considered these
slight
problems.
chill in his eyes.
The pampered royal
As long
family
as there are people by the
all
crown
refused to
prince's
accept
side,
the warmth of
it
the
wouldn't
sun.
be difficult
So the
to
villa was
slightly
built next to
influence
its
the
dense
crown
forest.
prince's destination.
It was next to the mountains,
and my reputation in
looked
the
out
capital
over the
has
lake,
always been
sheltering
based
it
on the
from the
word
sun
arrogant
and welcoming.
I reckoned
wind.
that
The
whoever
surface of the
arranged
lake
for
was
us
calm,
to meet the crown
but the
prince by
wind
chance
still
wouldn't have
blew
thought that
gently,
the crown prince wouldn't
taking
be
away the
angry at
last
me
bit of
for
dryness
stealing
in
the
the
silver,
forest.
and that I would
Fan
behave
Xian stood on the
myself.
grass by
It's
the
just
lake,
that I don't know the
looking at the
rules of the
scenery in
palace.
front of him.
For
He was
example,
full of
how
admiration.
long does it
The
usually take
activities
for
of
the
the
crown
emperor's
prince
farm
to travel
were
out of the
indeed
capital?
different.
Their
We
living
arrived at the
conditions
summer
were
resort
much better
yesterday.
than those of
If
the
the
common
crown
officials.
prince decided to
When
come
they
here
entered
a
the
few
summer
days ago,
villa, then we can be
Ruo
sure that this
somehow
was a coincidence,
managed to persuade
and not
the
an
royal
arrangement
guards
by
to
someone
leave the
with
old
ulterior
nannies at the
motives.
front of the villa to
Wang
drink
Qinian
tea
analyzed.
and play mahjong.
Fan Xian
Only a group
shook
of
his head
young
again.
people remained.
I
by the
already
way.
asked the princess
The guard
when I
were
was in the
either
carriage.
standing
When
or
the crown
sitting in
prince
distance.
travels,
and the
as
servant
long as he
girls
doesn't
rarely
stray
came out to
more than
play.
28 miles
They
from the
chattered
capital.
incessantly.
Then he only
reducing
needs
the
to report
peace of the
to
lake.
palace.
But without
all
the
the preparations
preparations
will
will
take about a
disturb
day.
Looking at the time we met,
still felt
the crown
very
prince will
comfortable.
probably leave
He was a little
the
further
palace
away
this
from the
morning.
crowd.
Wang
He gritted his
Qinian
teeth
looked at
and
Fan
made a
Xian
face to chase
worriedly
away
and
the
said in a
servant
low
girl,
voice,
Siki.
What benefit
Finally,
could the person who
Fan
arranged
Xian was
this
able to
matter
spend some
have?
time alone with
Fan
Wan-er.
Xian laughed. It's so hard. There are many benefits.
Fan Xian sighed.
If the crown
His right
prince
hand
really
slithered through the
humiliates
green
me,
grass like
I
a
reckon that
snake,
the fan
and
family
like
will have
lightning,
no choice
he grabbed
but to
Wan-er's
carry the
soft
flag
little
and
hand.
show our allegiance.
His face was still
Is
calm
it the second
as he
looked
prince?
at the lake.
Wang
It's so
Qinian
hard
probed.
to see the girl.
Fan
Her
Xian
hand was
thought
caught
that during this
Wan-er's
period
face
of time
immediately
after
turned
entering the
red.
capital.
She lowered her
second
head
prince
and
had
had
repeatedly summoned
but she
him,
didn't pull her hand
but he had
back.
never met him.
In a low
He really
voice,
didn't know what
she
kind of
scolded,
character this man.
"You're calling the
who
girl
was
at this time?
unwilling to be a
I don't know
peaceful
who it is that
prince
shamelessly
was.
climbs the
However,
walls and windows.
he would not judge
everything arbitrarily." In a quiet voice, he said, "Who knows?"
Chapter 1.
Everyone in the palace. Fan Xian chuckled.
I don't
didn't
care.
argue.
He
It would
just
be a
used the
lie
tip
to
of his
say
finger
that
to
he didn't
scratch
care.
the palm
He
of his
still arranged
fiancée.
for Wang Qinian
Although
to
he
get
was
out
an
of the
old
carriage
virgin
to see
who had lived 2 lives.
if anyone was following.
He was still a member of
He
the new
believed that
generation
with Wang
who had been
Qinian's
nurtured by
ability,
Takashi
if
Kado.
someone was
How
secretly
could Lin
watching
Wan-er
him on the
resist
official
these
little
road?
tricks, then he would
The girl
certainly
felt
be
a
able to
burst
catch
of
them.
panic
If
and
there was
couldn't
no
sit
one
still.
watching over his
Fan Xian
caravan
moved
to
closer.
facilitate that
Why don't you
chance
lean into
encounter
my
on the
arms?
official road?
Big brother
Then
really
it could
has a
only
way.
mean that he was
Fan
overly
Xija
sensitive
refused to get out of the
paranoid.
carriage.
He
Fan
thought there were
Xian
too many
smiled
mosquitoes
bitterly
in the grass
and leaned
He looked at
against
the couple by the
soft
lake
cushions of the
and
carriage,
sighed in admiration,
hoping that he really was
We've
being
only just met
overly
our
sensitive.
future sister-in-law, and we can already sit together. If we stay a few more hours.
Chapter 1.
Won't we have to consummate
There was
our
a house on the side of Shunzheng
Fan
Road
Ro
in the
burst
capital.
out laughing.
Although she
Qinian had
knew
spent
that her brother would
120
occasionally
tales of
visit
silver
her
to buy
sister-in-law
it.
at night,
There had been a number
she didn't know
of
how
procedures,
often Fan
and he
Xian
believed that
and Lin
no one
wanted
would be
met.
able to find
So
out
when she
who
saw
the
this
real owner
scene,
was.
she was
Fan
surprised
Xian
and
frowned
impressed
as he looked at the
come
two
down
men
and help
tied up
unload the
tightly in the
things.
corner.
Their mouths
patted
were
Fan
stuffed
Xian on
full
the
of
head
smelly
and
rags.
smiled.
And
It's
their
not
faces
good to
were
let the
red.
guards do it.
Tears were
Fan
streaming
Xian
from the
stared
corners
at
of
her.
their eyes.
What are the
They
servants
couldn't
for?
speak,
Fan
and they couldn't
Ruoruo
kill
smiled.
themselves by
They're just
biting their
maids.
tongues.
They're not
What are
as
they
strong
called?
as you.
Fan
For some
Xian
reason,
asked quietly.
seeing Fan
The fourth
Rose
bureau
faint
personnel
smile
behind
made
Wang
Fan
Qinian
Xia,
bowed
the
and
spoiled
replied,
brat,
7 miles
feel
outside
an
the city.
inexplicable fear.
Sir Wang found
He
traces
obediently
of the
climbed
other party.
down from
After they were
carriage
stopped
and
by
began
us,
to help the
they tried to
delicate
quibble,
maids
but they
unload
couldn't
the
withstand
things.
our
It
investigation.
was no wonder that
so they
Fan
admitted
Rose
to it. Wanted his
After
help.
you left the capital
Fan Xian had brought a
yesterday,
lot of
these
things with
two
him on this
people
trip,
have been following
and it took
you.
the maids and
I don't know what
Fan
method
Xia
they used to
half a
inform
day
their
to
people,
unload them.
but I don't know what
Fan
relationship
Xia
they
wiped
have with
the
the
sweat
Eastern
from his
Palace
forehead
to
and
arrange
shouted
this
to the
coincidental
lakeside
meeting.
Big brother,
Fan Xian furrowed
unload
his
all the
brows.
things.
He had not
Were they?
thought that his random
Fan
guess
Xian,
would actually
who was
reveal
sitting
a
by the
clue
lake to a
heard the
conspiracy.
shout.
It
and
looked like it
only
was
then
not
did
that
he
he was
remember
too
these
wise,
things.
but
He
that
slapped
his
his
enemies
forehead
were too
and
stupid.
apologized to
Jingdo
Warner with some
was too
embarrassment.
dark.
He
and
stood up
everyone
and
had
brushed
a
the
forked
grass
black
off his
tail
bottom.
behind him.
He walked
He
to
also
the side of the
understood
carriage
that the
and began to
investigation
give
his
orders to
subordinates
everyone
spoke
on
of
how
must
to
have
arrange
involved
things.
torture.
After
But
settling
since they had
down in the
admitted to
capital,
no
his
one cared
grandmother
what
had
methods
sent
they
over
used.
all the belongings
Did you
he
find
had
out
left
who they
behind
were?
in Danzhou.
Fan
So they were
Xian
all
asked
put to
Wang
use today.
Qinian in a low
There were
voice.
3 handmade
Wang
tents,
Qinian
an iron
shook his
barbecue
head.
grill. The less
A
I
few
know,
pieces of
the
iron
better.
mesh.
So
A
I
bag
waited
of
for you
pepper
to
and
interrogate
cumin,
them
some
personally.
salt, some bamboo sticks, some
Fan Xian
eggs,
nodded.
a few fresh
He was happy
with
with
his
his
big pile of
cautiousness.
radish and tofu,
But then he fell into
in a bag of fine
thought.
charcoal.
He looked at the
In
2
short,
men in the corner.
it was a complete
and could
barbecue
easily
grill.
see something
A maid
else in their
pointed at the
eyes.
pile of rags.
They had such a
and asked
determined
curiously,
expression.
"What is
but
this?"
had not been trained
Fan
in
Xian
torture.
kindly explained.
Firstly,
a
they
tent.
couldn't be from
The
the
servant girl
Overwatch
was
Council.
very eager to learn.
Secondly,
Is it used for
they
marching
couldn't
and
be from the
fighting?
palace.
Fan
They had
Xian
already
smiled
been
slightly
examined
and
said,
found not to
you
be
can also
eunuchs.
watch the stars.
So
by
the most
lake at
likely
night.
culprit was
Seeing
the
the
second
amiable
prince's
smile
personal
on
power.
young Master
Of
Fan's
course,
face,
the great
and
prince
warmth
at the
in his
foot
bright
of
eyes.
Eam Mountain,
the maid was
couldn't
no
escape
longer
suspicion.
eager to learn.
At that moment,
She
Fan
shyly
Xian
covered her
suddenly
face
thought of something
and
his
went somewhere
father Count
else.
Sinan had said.
After the charcoal
when you
fire
don't know
was
who your
lit,
enemy is,
someone came over to
don't
take
make
over.
random enemies.
Fan Xian
Even if you
moved
know
a
who
rock
your enemy
and
is,
sat by the
so
iron
what?
mesh. If he found
Carefully
out
smearing
that it was the
sauce and
second
condiments on
prince
the
who did
fish.
it,
Could
a
he
bamboo
really
skewer
skewer his
passed
way
through the
into the
fish.
manor?
Fan
And a faint
Xian
aroma
smiled bitterly.
wafted through
He knew
the
that
fire.
some things were
He
better
sniffed
left
and looked at
unclarified.
Warner, who was
There's no
sitting
need to
alone by
ask.
the lake in the
Fan
distance.
Xian rubbed
He
his
smiled
space
slightly
between his brows
and did not put too much
It seemed he was a
flavor
bit
into the
depressed
fish.
there.
Killed
After
them
he
all.
finished grilling
Yes.
3 skewers
His subordinates
of fish,
were all
he gave one to
malicious
each of the
spirits of the
siblings
Overwatch
and
Council.
walked over to the lake.
So they were not
sitting next
surprised
to
by
Lin
this
Warner.
bloody order.
Here, Fan Xian smiled warmly.
They calmly
Lin
walked
Warner
forward,
looked at him
pulled out the
suspiciously,
knives at their sides,
wondering if his cooking
and
would be
stabbed
good.
them into
She
the
took
waist
it
of the 2
and
men.
carefully put it to her
2
lips.
spluttering
then
sounds
chewed
rang
it
out
slowly,
and the 2 men's
her eyes
feet kicked
gradually
wildly.
brightened.
Their
As she
eyes
looked
rolled
at
back
Fan
and
Xian
they
and
died.
giggled.
Bury him
She did not
properly.
even have time to
Fan
praise
Xian
him
ordered
before she
He
began
didn't put
to
on
eat.
any
But the
pretentious
fish was
expression
too
of
hot,
sorrow,
and she
Yes,
could not bear to
the
let it leave
subordinate
her
replied.
lips.
After
She stuck
leaving
out her
the
tongue
courtyard,
because it was
they
so
walked
hot,
through the small
and her
alleys of the
free
capital
hand
for a
kept
long
fanning her
time
mouth
before
as
they
she
stepped
exhaled.
onto the main road.
She was cute.
Wang
Really
Qinian
cute,
accompanied
and could be
him
loved.
for a walk.
Fan Xian
Maintaining
looked at
the
her
fleshy
fleshy
lips
courtesy that a
and for some reason
should have. He thought of the chicken
Fan
leg
Xian
they had suddenly
first
met
said,
in the Temple of
"Will
Qi.
the envoys from
Shen'er,
Northern
she
Qi
teased.
and Dongi arrive?
I brought you plenty
The
of chicken
council
legs
should
these
have
days.
this information.
Why are you still so
Wang
greedy?"
Qinian replied.
Lin Warner puffed
From
up
the
her
moment they
cheeks
entered the country,
and said angrily,
"The fourth bureau
if I had
has
known
been
your
assisting
grilled
the
food
local
would taste
authorities
so
in
good,
receiving them.
I wouldn't have
Judging
eaten
by the
that
date,
cold chicken.
they should
leg."
arrive at the beginning
Fan
of
Xian
next
laughed
month.
heartily and
Fan
almost fell
Xian
back.
nodded.
His
Help me find out who
fiancé's
they
temperament
are.
was really
Also,
interesting.
He paused for a
Sometimes
moment.
she was extremely
If this doesn't
shy,
count as
lowering her
breaking the
head
rules,
and not
could I
daring to
trouble
look
the
at him.
council to ask
Sometimes
our
she would have a
spies
little
in Northern
temper
Qi
that added to the
bring
fun.
back some
Her
information?
sickly body
It would
liked
be
to play
best
the
if they
tiger
could find
cub.
out what the
It was
bottom
still that
line
one
in
word
Northern Qi envoys
Cute.
are negotiating.
2
with
words.
is.
Cute.
Wang Qinian
3
had heard
words
the crown
why.
prince's words
Lin Warner
earlier,
turned her head,
so he knew
and
that
saw that
the
the
master
barbecue
fan was
stall
going to be the
was
assistant
much
envoy.
livelier than
He
the
spoke
one
in a
by
low
the lake.
voice.
Fan
Yan
Xia had
Bingyun,
long since
the son of the
finished
head of the
fish
fourth
in his
bureau,
hand and was
Yin
instructing
Ruohai,
a servant
has
girl
been lurking
to
in
grill
Northern Qi
some corn
for 4
him to eat.
years. Only
He's had some
Ruo
success
ate in a more
so I
graceful
reckon he
manner.
should have some good
As she
information.
ate,
She
Fan
walked
Xian
through
reminded
the
him,
woods.
"Don't
It was
talk
hard to
about
tell
this kind
whether
of thing
she was
too much
enjoying
in
the
future.
scenery
If Northern
or
Shi found
thinking
out
about
something,
I'm
her
afraid
gaze
Master
fell on the
Yan's son
pile
would
of
be in
things
danger.
that had been
Wang
unloaded from the
Qinian
carriage.
smiled.
And Lin
Master,
Wander felt
as
that
the
her
commissioner,
fiancé was
you
a
have
bit
the
strange.
authority to know about
She
this.
asked curiously.
Fan Xian
in the
also
past,
smiled.
when we went out to
It's
play,
better to know less
we
about
mostly
this kind
ate
of thing that involves
I've
taking
never seen the
responsibility.
servants so
Wang
happy.
Qinian looked at the
And the
gentle
things you
smile
brought today,
on Fan
no matter how you
Xian's
look at it,
handsome face,
are a bit
and
strange.
thought of the murders in the council.
Fan Xian
He
smiled
couldn't help
and
but
explained,
feel a little strange.
although they're all servant
If it's better
girls,
not to know,
they're all
then
serving
why do you
maids
still
who
need to
follow you
investigate?
around every
The
day?
deaths of those two
They live
men
a life
don't
of
seem
luxury.
necessary.
How many of
Fan
them have
Xian
actually
calmly
cooked for
replied,
themselves?
Although it's better
Today's
not to know,
barbecue doesn't
still need to
necessarily
investigate.
taste all that
Those
good.
two men must
But it's
die.
better to cook for
because
yourself.
I have to let others know that I
It
know
feels
what
different,
they don't want
and
me
the
to know.
reaction of the
The
taste
two lies
buds
are a
is also
warning to
different.
them not to
Taste
try to
buds
manipulate me.
Lynn
again.
Warner was a bit confused.
It seems that Yolande Street
She stared at
didn't make those
Fancienne
high
with
and
wide
mighty
eyes.
people behave
There's a small
themselves.
organ
The
on
death
the
of my
tongue that can
brother-in-law
sense
at the
flavors.
foot of the Tsang Mountains
Fancienne
was
knew that it
caused
was
by
difficult to
Sigurd Jian.
explain.
Perhaps they
After
think
all,
I'm easy to
the
bully.
naked I was not as good
Although
as
the
a
series of
microscope.
no,
So he
was a
casually
bit of a
explained,
tongue twister.
the back of the tongue
and Wang
tastes
Qinian
bitter,
was a bit confused.
and the front of the tongue
He
tastes
gradually
sweet.
understood the
That's
meaning
why.
and nodded.
Lynn Warner chuckled.
Fancienne suddenly
No wonder
smiled.
you are master-faced.
Don't worry.
You're
I've never
so
seen
clear
blood
about these
or
things.
dead people. Hearing
You
her
don't know how I
mention
grew up.
Fei Jia, Fancienne felt a
In the days that
bellyful of
followed,
anger.
the world
After all,
was peaceful.
they were master
The deaths
and
of the
disciple,
two nameless
and
men,
they had a
didn't
good
seem to
relationship.
matter.
He had
But
been in the capital
Fancienne
for a
was
few
sure that
months,
this matter
and
had
even
already
Chun
begun to
Ping
take
had
effect.
returned.
Why did
Occasionally,
Fei
he would go to
Jia not wanna
Taichung
come
Temple
back?
to do
This
his
is a bit
morning
too
roll.
much.
Occasionally,
Fancienne
he would go to
these matters
Dombo
aside
bookstore
for now.
to collect money.
Seeing Warner's
Occasionally,
envious gaze,
he would go to the
he set up
tofu
a
shop
small
to work.
stove for the two of them.
Occasionally,
He
would
brought
go to
some
the Prime
ingredients
Minister's
over,
manor
and
to
the
get
two of them
closer
ate
to his
as they
future
roasted.
father-in-law.
Of course, most of the time,
he would
was
sneak into the
Fancienne
royal
roasting
courtyard of
and
Lynn
Lynn
Warner
Warner
eating. Occasionally,
surrounded by the
he would stay at
fragrance,
Fan Manor
the
to tell his
fiancé
sister stories,
launched
and
a
copy
gentle
books.
attack on
That
the
night,
ingredients
he
over
washed
the
up
warm
and prepared to go to
charcoal
bed.
fire.
His gaze fell on the black
This
leather
seasoning
suitcase
doesn't
that had
seem
been
to be
carelessly
common.
tossed to
Lynn
the side.
Warner stuck out
He
the
didn't
tip
know
of her
what was in
tender
the
tongue
suitcase,
and
so
gently
he
licked
licked
the
a
naturally
sesame
curious.
seed from the corner
But
of her
after
mouth.
staying in the same
She
room
sighed
for
with
so
satisfaction
long and not knowing
It
where
really
the key
smells
went,
good.
he
He
couldn't
couldn't
help
help
but
but
feel a bit numb.
Sesame seeds
Of course,
are
if he knew
everywhere.
that Chun Ping
This bit of
Ping
cumin
also
is
cared about
not
the
easy to
suitcase,
find.
he would certainly
Fancienne thought to
reevaluate its
himself,
value. If it
he
weren't
wouldn't
for
just
his good
toss it in the
relationship
room
with
like
the
trash.
shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall,
Instead,
it would have been
dig a
difficult
large
to gather
hole under
all
the
the
bed
ingredients
and cover
he had
it
brought
with
to the
3
summer
layers
villa.
of steel.
But what he
Where was
said
the
was,
key?
if
It
you
was
like
as if God had
after we
suddenly
get
heard
married,
the greatest
I'll make
question
it for you
in
every
his
day.
heart.
Lynn
Cold
Warner's
voice rang
expression
out,
changed
Fancienne's
very
ear.
quickly.
The
Of
key
course,
is in the
it
palace.
wasn't the kind of change
then,
where she would turn her
without
back on
any
him.
wind,
It was just that
a
when she
black
heard the
stick came
word
from the
"get
heavens
married"
and smashed
she habitually
viciously
lowered
into
her head
Fancienne's
shyly.
back. But
There was a
today's scene
muffled
was
sound.
not very suitable.
Fancienne couldn't
Her
dodge in
lips were
time
still
and was
greasy,
heavily knocked to the
and there was a
ground.
smear of
His
dust
back
on the
hurt,
tip of her nose.
and he coughed in pain.
No matter how you
blowing
looked
a
at it,
few strands
she looked like a
of dust
little
from his
girl
face.
who had been secretly
You've
eating
regressed
in her own
Although
kitchen.
Wu Zhu's voice was
Fancienne looked at her
emotionless
face
and
it was clear
chuckled.
that he held a
Yichun
rather
was not
negative
a
attitude
particularly beautiful
towards
girl.
Fancienne's
But for
performance.
some reason,
Uncle,
in his eyes,
Fancienne had grown
he always
accustomed
felt that there was
to this
nothing
kind of
to
life.
nitpick about her
With great
features.
difficulty,
There was not a
he crawled
sliver
up
of
from
her
the ground.
demeanor that was
He
not
slowly
cute.
circulated
Seeing
the
him
Jin
laugh
Qi
at her,
in his body.
Lynn Warner
alleviating
angrily
the pain
prepared
in
his
his
pants.
Looking at the dark
Fancienne
corner
hurriedly
of the wall,
opened his
he
arms,
couldn't help
ready
but
to
whisper,
sacrifice himself
"Uncle,
to feed
I
the
haven't
tiger.
seen you for so
In
many
any
days.
case, the
I've been
lakeside
worried to
was
death."
far away.
Wu
and
Zhu
a
was
large
not
cluster
used to
of
the
aquatic
passion in his
plants
words.
blocked the
He
maid's
coldly
view.
took half a step
Fancienne
back and
thought he
coldly
could
cut
openly
through
embrace
Fancienne's
a beautiful
lies.
woman for the first
I know.
time.
You're not worried about
Unexpectedly,
me.
Warner looked
Fancienne
embarrassed
smiled somewhat bitterly
and forcibly
He
stopped
really
herself
wasn't
from
worried.
rolling into
Wu Zhu was a
Fancienne's
perverted
arms.
grandmaster assassin.
He
Fancienne
believed
shook his
that
head
no matter where he
helplessly.
went,
He
would
took
be
his
fine.
handkerchief to the
But
lakeside
Fancienne
and
hadn't
wet
seen
it.
him for a long
Then he turned
time,
around
and
he
sat
really
next
did
to
miss
Lynn
him.
Warner.
He was
He
curious
stared at her face
as to what he had been
and
up
very
to.
carefully
Perhaps
wiped
Uncle
away
Wu
the
Zhu
dust on
had
the tip of
always
her
been
nose
by
and
his
chin.
side. The two of
And
them
he
were
didn't
very
know?
close.
Wu Zhu
Feeling her
continued,
husband's
"The
gentle
key is in the
focused
palace."
gaze. The second
Lynn
repetition
Warner was
brought
extremely
Fancienne
nervous.
back to
Her
his
hands
senses.
tightly
He frowned
gripped the
slightly
hem of her dress,
and then suddenly understood.
Fancienne also
So he'd
noticed
been
her
looking for the key
nervousness.
all this
For a
time.
moment,
This
he
is
was
the
at a
lady's
loss.
relic.
The
I
hand
shouldn't have
holding
listened
the
to
wet
Chen
handkerchief
Ping
paused
and
on
left
the
the
side
key
of
in
her
the capital.
cheek. Their eyes met.
Wu
And it
Zhu's
seemed that
tone
even the
was
sound of their
different.
breathing
I've been looking in
began
the
to
palace for a few
intertwine,
days,
rising and
I've come up
falling.
with 3
They began to
possible
mix
places
and
Too
gradually
risky.
increase in
Fancienne
frequency.
growled in a low
Action
voice.
was better than action.
Deep in his heart, without
He was a
saying
little
anything,
angry. Fan lowered his head
had the
and kissed her
power
on
of
the
a
forehead.
grandmaster.
Lin
The
Wanner
palace
was
was no
startled
place
and
to
then
be trifled
embarrassed.
with.
Following
The guards
that,
were all
she was
experts,
faintly disappointed.
and Fei Jie had
However,
once mentioned that the
she
most
didn't have time to hide
mysterious
her
of the
disappointment.
4 grandmasters
Fan
had
Xian's
always been
lips
hidden
had
within the
already
palace.
blocked them out.
Wu Zhu
She
had
was
risked
about to
staying in the
pretend to
palace
rebuke.
for so many
It was
days.
wet, soft,
If he had been discovered,
fragrant, and sweet.
the mysterious
Ouch.
grandmaster
Fan
would have
Xian
acted.
found that his
With
lower
the addition
lip
of
had been
500 armed
ruthlessly
guards,
bitten by the
even
little
if
girl.
Wu Zhu's
He
skills
quickly
were
straightened
divine,
up. He
and
wouldn't
let
have been
his
able to
lips
come out
escape
alive.
the scene of the crime.
As if he hadn't noticed
Focusing his
Fan
eyes,
Xian's anger,
he found that
Wu
Wanner's
Zhu
eyes were
continued to
full of
speak.
smiles.
Do you want the key?
However,
Fan
there was an
Xian
additional
calmed down.
glimmer of
He understood
spring
why Wu
radiance
Zhu had
in
come
the
today.
smile.
Wu
It was like
Zhu
the
had
lake
always been a
beside the two
person
of
who
them.
hid in the dark.
The water
If there
rippled
wasn't
like a
something they
mirror,
needed to talk
but there
about,
were still slight
Fan Xian
highs
suspected
and
that
lows
Wu
and
Zhu
gentle
would
currents
never
that
see
stirred
him
one's
again.
soul.
And would
The
only
cutest thing was
protect
that
him
when
from
a girl
shadows.
smiled
And
faintly,
tonight,
her white
Wu
front
Zhu had
teeth,
come to ask
she
for the
cutely
key,
bit down on
not
her
to ask
fleshy
for
lower
Fan
lip.
Xian's opinion.
Fan Xian's
because
heart
this
skipped a
matter
beat,
required his
summoning his
participation.
remaining courage.
But He pulled
it was
his
difficult
future
for
wife
Wu Zhu to
into
take
his
something
arms,
from this world,
not letting
what
her
could
escape.
Fan Xian help him
His
with?
finger gently
As Fan
touched her
Xian
soft
thought about
cheek.
it,
He said
in a quiet
quietly,
voice, he said,
"What do you need me to
Little
do?
tiger,
There are
be
3
careful that I
places in the
don't eat
palace
you."
that are difficult
Lin
to
Wanner's
enter."
body tensed
Wu Zhu
and
said
froze
expressionlessly.
Her
Fan
eyes,
Xian was
like a
curious
spring
about
lake,
which 3
remained
places they
bewitching,
were, and
she bit her
asked,
lower lip and
"Xingqing
gazed
Palace,
at Fan Xian.
Han
Wanner's
Palace,
body isn't
and
well.
Guangxin Palace.
Are you willing?"
Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Within the palace,
Chapter 118.
these 3 places
If he was
were the
willing,
most heavily
how could he
guarded.
gain without
They were the
giving up?
residences of the
But
emperor.
Fan Xian
the
looked at this
Empress
little
Dowager,
wife
who was
and the
allowing
eldest
him
princess.
to taste her.
Not
It
only
was
were they the most
impossible for her
difficult
to
places
transform
enter in the
into
palace,
Lixiao,
but they were also
his
the
heart
most
was already
difficult
burned.
places in the world.
If you let go now,
I want you to think of a
Fan
way to
Xian would
get that
despise
eunuch Hong
himself.
Xi
Eating
out
was
of the palace
eating.
for 2 hours.
There was no need to be
Fan
polite
Xian
at
frowned
the dining
slightly.
table.
Eunuch
So the
Hong,
two
the head of
gradually
the palace
merged into
eunuchs,
one person.
a senior statesman.
Although there were
of 3
trees and water
dynasties.
blocking the
I
view,
heard that he has
the
been in the
lake
palace
and the mountains
since
were
the
bright
founding of the
and
nation,
beautiful,
and
the
has
scene of
great
the young
power.
couple being
But if you want to
intimate
steal the
was
key from the
always
palace,
faintly seen
why do you want
by
me
the
to trick him
servant
out of the
girls.
palace?
The servant
What
girls
does
were
this have to
clever
do with
and
anything?
moved their gazes
He suddenly
away.
understood something.
Some bent over to
and
flip
raised
to
his
me.
head in surprise.
Some turned
to
their
look at
backs
the black cloth
and pretended
on
to check the
Wu Zhu's
girl's
face.
makeup box.
With a trembling
and some
voice,
didn't know what
he
to
said,
do.
They
Could
could
it be
only
that
lower
eunuch
their
Hong
bodies
is
and
the most
call out
mysterious
softly,
grandmaster
pretending to be
in
a
the
poor
legends?
girl with a sprained ankle.
Fei Jie had
Fan
once
Xizhe
said
was
that of the
chewing
4 great
didn't notice the
grandmasters,
demons.
one
Quarreling
was
by the
Sigu
lake.
Jian of Dong
Ruo
City.
was walking
Another
by
was
the forest
Ku
to
He,
digest her
the
food,
imperial
and
advisor
didn't
of
seem to
Northern
see
Qi.
this side.
And
And
another
the
was
reason
Yi
why the
Luyan
servant
of the
girls
kingdom of
didn't
Qing.
cough dozens
The
of
last one
times
was also
to
from the
prevent
kingdom
such
of
an
Qing,
immoral
but
thing
no
from
one knew
happening
who he was.
because of Fan Xian's spoon-feeding
Even with the
policy
power of
these
the
days.
Overwatch Council,
If one wanted to
they could
plot
only
for state
vaguely
affairs,
sense that this
one
great
had to bribe the
grandmaster
head of
was
the
hiding
eunuchs.
in the royal
If one wanted to
palace of
plot
the
for
kingdom of
family
Qing.
affairs,
Wu Zhu
one
shook
had
his
to
head.
bribe
I don't
the
know.
personal servant
I haven't
girls.
fought him,
Fan
but I do
Xian
know that in the
understood
palace,
this deeply.
the one who can most
So these
easily
days,
find
he
me
rewarded
is
them
the eunuch
every
Hong
once in a
Xi
while.
Xiang.
Relying
Fan
on his
Xian nodded.
position as
In
an
his
assistant
mind,
minister
given
of the Ministry
Wu
of
Zhu's
Revenue
cautiousness,
and the fact that
this
Domble
old
bookstore
eunuch Hong
was
must be an
constantly raking in
unfathomable
money,
figure in the
he was
palace.
very generous.
If even Wu Zhu
the servant
was afraid of
girls
him,
were very
then perhaps
happy,
eunuch
and
Hong's
they had long
identity as
tilted
a
the scales in
grandmaster was
favor of
already
their
on the
future
verge of being
son-in-law.
revealed.
After
Given
an
Wu
indeterminate amount
Zhu's
of cold
time,
temperament,
the two
he could
people
even
by the
kill
lake
Yi Luyan,
finally
but he couldn't
separated
kill
with
him.
difficulty
Naturally,
breathing.
he wouldn't
They were
fear
panting,
any grandmaster
and their
in the
hair
world.
was slightly
Last time,
disheveled.
he
They
had
looked
attacked
somewhat
violently
disheveled.
to hide his
It didn't look like they were
relationship with
intimate,
Fan Xian,
but more
this
like they had
time,
fought.
However,
Lin Wanner
tried to
stretched
steal
out
the
her
key,
hand,
so his
and
style
ran her
was somewhat
hand through her
different.
hair.
Fan
Out of the
Xian
corner of her
thought
eye,
about his recent
she glanced at the
arrangements, connecting the
distant
matter of
servant girls.
envoys from
She guessed that no one had seen
them,
them,
but
she
she
still
still
couldn't think of a
angry
good
and
way to
embarrassed.
establish a
She glared
relationship
fiercely
with the
at
head
Fan
eunuch in the
Xian,
palace.
thinking
It was
that
also
this was
not
too
convenient
absurd
to ask
in
his
broad
father
daylight.
for help.
But there
Otherwise,
seemed
he
to
would
be a
have to
lingering
explain
sweet scent
many
on her
things that
lips,
he didn't want to
and
explain.
it made the little girl's
Suddenly,
heart flutter
his
with
eyes
sweetness.
brightened.
Were
One
you
you
afraid
should
of?
know about the palace.
I've never seen you so
She lived in the palace
uncomfortable at night.
until the beginning of this
Fan
year,
Xian quietly
and only
moved
moved
out
out
at
at
the
the beginning of
His
this
finger
year.
used a little
Tomorrow,
trick to
I'll go
gently
see
flick
her.
her white and
Wu Zhu
smooth
looked at him
earlobe.
non-committally
Wanna let out another soft
and said
cry.
coldly,
She couldn't
"I
hold
only
it in
want you to
anymore.
drag Hong
She
Xi
clenched her
Xiang out of
small
the palace
fist
for 2 hours
and punched him in the chest.
As for how you do it,
she murdered
that's
her
your
husband.
business."
In his previous
Fan Xian
life,
shrugged.
Fan
Uncle
Xian and his
you
companions
always give me
had
the most
long
difficult
since
tasks.
grown tired of this joke.
This was a naughty
But
joke,
saying it to his
and he
real
hadn't talked to Wu
fiancée
Zhu
for
by
a
the
while,
lake gave him
so he
a
seemed to
different
have
feeling.
forgotten that Wu Zhu didn't have much
Wanner
of a sense of
snapped at
humor.
him, and
Wu
Fan
Zhu
Xian
said
felt a sharp pain
seriously,
in his wrist.
"Then I'll go kill
He forced
Hong
himself
Xi
not
Xiang.
to cry out.
Whether I succeed
He smiled
or not,
bitterly and
I
said,
can probably stall
"It's not
him
a
for
fight
6
between
hours.
fairies.
You go to the palace.
Why are you so
and
fierce?
find a key."
The story
Fan
of the
Xian
fairies
found that he had picked
fighting
up a hot
a meteorite
73rd chapter
and
of the
smashed
Dream
it on his
of the
foot.
Red Chamber.
He quickly
The
said
silly
with
big
the
sister
utmost
picked up a
respect,
sachet
"It's just
from
to
the
steal
Grandview
something.
Garden. On the
It's not too
sachet
risky
was an
to challenge
embroidered
Hong
image
Xi
of a
Xiang.
naked man.
I'll try to
and
get
a
in touch
woman
with him."
hugging and sitting
After Wu
cross-legged.
Zhu left,
The silly big
Fan
sister
Xian remembered
did
that
not
he
know
couldn't know that it was an erotic painting. If he did arrange everything the fairies were fighting, how would he inform this? She casually handed it over to Madame Xing. He looked at the black scene of the Grandview Garden being raided. If the key had to be placed, no one in the kingdom of Jing should have known this story. Then there must be something. But a few days ago, Lin Warner had heard that her Lang Jun had opened a bookstore that claimed to have the entire story of the stone, a map of the border. So she had forced Fancy of high-ranking spies in the Overwatch Council. Hearing these words today, she immediately a map of the Yi family's treasure. What kind of person do you think I am? Could no longer sleep peacefully. He stood up and kicked the suitcase under the bed. Of course, I am a good person. As if he felt that it would be much safer this way. Someone in the past has said that when fairies fight, they fight with the utmost Fancy and calmly went to Ruo's room and asked her for some needles. We were just fairies quarreling. Ruo couldn't dissuade him. I don't know where
So
you
she
got
took out
this
a few
crooked
small
theory
needles from the box,
but you still have
and
to
handed
borrow the
them to
name
him.
of someone in the
She
past.
was curious.
Lynn
Looking
Warner
into her
giggled.
brother's eyes.
Besides,
She asked,
what's the difference between
"This is for
fairies
embroidery.
fighting and quarreling?
Is your clothes torn?
In a fight,
You can give
the
it to the
hands
servant girl."
dance and the feet
Fan
dance.
Xian smiled.
Every part
It's
of
much
the
more
body
complicated
that
than
has to
sewing
be
clothes.
used. When
He
comes
thought
to
for a moment,
quarreling,
then
of
said,
course,
"Don't let
only the
anyone
mouth
know
is
that I took
used.
3 needles
Die."
from you."
Fan
Fan's
Xian's
heart
heart
was filled with
confused.
pride.
Then
The
I'll
wedding
die on
was
top
imminent.
of you.
During the
Fan
summer
Manor
retreat
had
had already
heat.
begun
A
preparations.
man and a woman
There
in
was
love
something
were in the
strange
midst
about
of a
Fan Xian
beautiful
and
lake
Lin Wan
and
Er's
green
marriage.
mountains.
So
It was
all
the
the
easiest
rules
time
had
to
to be
pass.
reestablished.
In the blink of an
At
eye,
least
it
it
was
wouldn't be
already
like
noon.
other consorts,
The old nannies,
where the royal
who had been
family
left behind by
arranged the
Fan
prince
Ro
consort's
to
mansion.
play mahjong
After all,
in the front of the
Lin
manor,
Wan Er's
finally
status as a
remembered what they were
princess
here to
had
do.
always
They
been limited
eagerly
to the
rushed
palace.
over and
If it were to
smiled
be
at
done in
Fan
capital,
Xian.
it seemed that they had gained a
give
lot
rise
from the
to
Fan
rumors
family during the
The newly
mahjong
married
game.
mansion
But
was
Fan
next to Count
Xian
Sinan's.
still didn't like them.
It was just
With
an
the
empty
arrival of
garden,
these old
but
nannies,
Fan Xian had
no matter
begun
what,
preparations
he would
for
not
at
be
the
able to get
beginning of
close
the
to
year.
them.
So
He
it
had
had
to
long
sit
since
and be
been taken
polite,
care of in splendor.
and he was far away
There was a
from water.
door in the
At
back
noon,
garden of the two
Fan
courtyards,
Xian could not
so
let
the front
Fan Xian
and
fool
back
around
manners
with
were
roasted
connected.
fish.
The
The
main
group of
entrance
people
to
returned to the
Fan Xian's
manor
courtyard
in a was on the
grandiose
opposite
manner.
side of the street.
They chose an
It had been
elegant
very
courtyard,
quiet in the past
and
few
servants
days.
went to prepare
The workers
food.
had stopped working
As they drank
long ago,
tea
and the trees
chatted,
and rockery
they heard
had
the
long
sound
been
of
taken
carriages
care of.
coming from afar.
They were nourished by
Fan
the
Xian
wind
and
and
Lin
water.
Warner stood up at the
Because
same
there weren't
time
many people
with a
around,
smile.
the
It
large
seemed that they
courtyard
both knew
seemed
who
very
was coming,
quiet.
but they
No one
found
wanted
that
to
the
stay
other
there
had
for
also
long.
stood
A
up.
black shadow
They couldn't
floated
help
by.
but look at each
It
other
was
in
Fan
surprise.
Xian.
They
He
were
had
guests,
quietly come to the
and they were all
courtyard,
guests,
holding a piece of tofu in his right
but Fan
hand,
Xian
and
three
Lin
silver
Warner had
needles
invited them
between the
separately.
4 fingers
At
of his left
first,
hand.
they
didn't
found a
know each
secluded
other,
place,
so when they saw
and
the people in
carefully
the carriages
placed the tofu
disembark,
cubes between
Fan
the
Xian
branches
and
and
Warner
Warner
were both surprised.
The tofu had become
Warner was surprised,
extremely tender,
but she was
after he
also
had
nervous
improved
and
it.
sad.
So it was placed
Fan
there
Xian was
trembling,
surprised,
as if it
but
could
he was
break
also
at any
nervous
time. And had
Fan
a
Xian
headache.
closed his
Lin Warner
eyes
had invited
and
you
slowly
later.
increased
She knew
the
of the
fight
radical
between the
Jinchu
two
of them outside the royal
Dantian.
courtyard.
It flowed
So
through
she
the
had
top of his
purposely
head
taken this
and into the
opportunity
snow
to
mountain
have you
behind his
linger
waist,
and Fan
forming
Xian
two
interact
Jinchu
more
channels,
and
one
eliminate
large
the
and
animosity
one
between
small.
them.
He
She
allowed his
also wanted
entire
to be the
body to
mediator
enter a
between
state
the
of
two of them.
tranquility.
Fan Xian
without a
naturally
single
understood
stray thought.
Warner's intentions.
The wind rose.
He smiled,
and Fan
and went
Xian's
forward,
entire
cupping
body
his hands
became
in
a gust of wind.
Greetings,
blowing
Missy.
toward the center
After
of
what
the
had
willow
happened
tree.
that day.
With a
The
light
linger's
touch,
nose was
the
still
tips of his
sore,
feet
but
valiantly
she showed
stopped
no
his
signs
forward
of
fall.
bashfulness.
And with a sudden
Instead,
sound,
he used his
she cupped her
control of his
hands
body
in a chivalrous
bounce
gesture.
back. It was like
Greetings,
a crafty
Master
fish
Fan,
playing with a
Master
fool's
Fan
hook.
is skilled.
After a while,
and I am
he
impressed.
slowly walked forward with
Fan
his hands
Xian
behind
chuckled,
his back.
but he had a
squinting
strange
at the
feeling in
piece
his
of
heart.
tofu.
Were
Were
they
they
going
going
to
to
shoot
shoot
a
a historical
There were
film?
3
thin
thin
needles
needles
on the tofu.
Fan Xian
and they were
watched
trembling
Yi Linger
slightly.
disembark from the carriage and greet his brother.
In that split second,
he lowered his voice.
He had
and
inserted
said
the
to
needles
Ruo,
into the
"Sister,
tofu
I
with
understand.
incredible speed.
My future
and
sister-in-law
arranged them
wants to be
in
a
the shape
mediator
of a triangle.
Fan
Based on
Ruo
Fan
made a sound
Xian's
of
understanding of the human
She
body.
smiled.
If
and
this
prepared
technique
to go forward
was
to
used to
greet
kill
her brother.
someone, it would
Unexpectedly,
certainly be very
she heard what
effective.
Fan Xian
He
said
retrieved
next
the needles
and
with
stopped in her
satisfaction.
tracks.
Ever
She
since
heard
Nuan
Fan
Street,
Xian
he had been
say
searching for a
rudely,
weapon.
"I'm
that suited
afraid
him
that when your
best.
sister-in-law
Wu Zhu's
opens the
weapon
door to
was a
welcome
stick-shaped
guests,
object.
she wants
Whether
to
it was a
welcome
wooden
younger
stick
sister.
or a simple iron
Fan
drill,
Ruo spat
in
and
Wu
knocked
Zhu's
Fan
hands,
Xian on
it was
the
a
forehead.
deadly weapon.
She scolded
This
him
was the
in a low
result of his
voice.
realm. Let's not
Fan
talk
Xian
about my
knew
brother's
very well
intentions.
that for him,
Even if he
a
wanted to
handy
marry,
weapon could
with
save his
Messia's
life
status
many times.
Would she be a
In
concubine?
fact, he very
In
much
her
liked
heart,
the slender
it didn't
dagger
matter who her brother
whether it
married,
was in
as
Danzhou
long as he
or
liked her.
Nilan Street.
In this
The
regard,
sharp dagger that
it was
Fei
similar to
Jie
Fan
had left behind
Xian's
had already helped
expectations of
twice.
her.
A fat
However,
man
this
disembarked
dagger
from the other
could
carriage.
not be brought
With the
in
help of a
certain
maidservant,
places,
such
he
as
looked
the royal
around in a
palace.
panic.
And
Fan
Xian
Xian gave
knew
Ruo
that since the
a
key
look
was in the royal
indicating
palace,
for her
he was
to
afraid make you
that,
linger to rest.
in the end,
with one
he would
hand,
have to be like the
he gently
swordsman
tugged
in the
on
novels of
Warner's
his
previous life.
Lynn Warner
and
looked at the
break
fat
through
man
the forbidden
and couldn't
area.
help but cover her
Wuju's
mouth with her
stick
hand.
and words
But
yesterday
she still let
had
out
stimulated
a
him a
soft
little.
cry.
And he had
When she
found
turned
some
her head to
passion
look
again.
at Fan
He looked at the three
her
needles on
eyes
his
were
finger,
full of gratitude,
reflecting the light
Go.
of the rising
Fan
sun,
Xian encouraged
couldn't
her
help
with a
but
gentle
frown.
smile. What kind of
And the two
poison
of them
should
walked
he apply
over
to
to
them?
Carriage.
Once he had a
When
goal,
the fat man
he did
saw
things
Fan
with passion.
His
So when
originally
Fan Xian
frightened
passionately
expression
entered Lin
immediately
Wan's
turned into a
boudoir on
wide
dark
smile.
night. She
The
couldn't
already
help
wide
but be
space
pleasantly
between his
surprised.
brows
After all,
became
it hadn't been that
even
long
longer.
since their last
He moved
outing.
forward a few steps
After a moment of
and
intimacy,
pulled Fan Xian's
Fan
hand.
Xian
Little
pretended
Xian
to casually ask
so it's
about
you.
matters in the
DeBeo,
royal palace.
didn't we agree
Lin Warner had
not to
grown
call
up
me
in the
that?
royal palace.
Fan Xian
and was
said
quite
with a pained
familiar with
expression.
his people. Lin
She
Warner
wasn't
was
curious
a little sad
why her fiancé
She
was
thought that her
suddenly
silly
interested in
brother
this. whom she had only seen a few times, was worried about the rules of entering the royal palace. But hearing Debeo call Fan Xian, so she couldn't help but laugh. The concubines in the royal palace are all Fan Xian nodded helplessly. And His Majesty doesn't want to look at Fan Xian. So it's not like the old emperor it's not convenient for me who died a few years ago. I know. Who had an endless supply of beauties. He turned and patted Debeo on the shoulder. There are also the great prince's mother. There's no polo today. The second prince's mother, Lady Shu. The courtyard, the third prince's bottom of the hill. It was wide open. A few other concubines. And they could see the blue. I don't think I need to pay my respects. Debeo sniffled. Fan Xian thought that those concubines naturally wouldn't want to offend the water is green. The eldest princess, Fan Xian, is deeply favored because the water isn't deep and controlled the palace. Then let's go see how deep. He shifted his body on the bed. Fan Xian's wishful thinking was to bring Debeo over. Why is the great prince's mother would prevent his brother-in-law from being bored at home all day? Curiously. And Lin Wan'er, it would give him a fancy. Ning the Talented is from Dong. In any case, she was captured by His Majesty on his. How could he know that Fan Xian had an innate sensitivity to things that on like the battlefield His Majesty? As soon as he saw a big idiot, and Ning the Talented took care of him day Fan Xian could only so His Majesty freed her from slavery with Debeo by and she entered the royal. He thought to himself that lunch was probably to the great prince, just as the silly son-in-law and she wasn't a citizen to walk out the door. So even though she saved the emperor, turned his head birth to his looked at Lin Wan'er she still couldn't win the empress dowager's favor. Why didn't you come? So she Lin Wan'er was startled at first. Besides, and then she was already an imperial. It turned out that her silly 10 years ago, whom she had only seen a few times, still remembered His Majesty was furious. She hurriedly responded and stepped forward to demoting her to a talented person. Fan Xian was slightly startled. The faint sound of mahjong tiles in the royal palace could be heard as he had imagined. The guards gathered in one place and continued. The world was peaceful. Eldest brothers and they all military exploits in the West. The servant girls were tired from playing. So Ning the Talented is able to maintain her position of yellow wine. They went to sleep. But now she seems to understand many things. They had long since withdrawn their curtains to rest. In fact, occasionally, I used to often go to her royal palace pond by the forest, but I haven't gone as often. Sound of fish breaking through the water. Fan Xian could be asked about some of the secrets. It made the imperial summer villa, and Lin Wan'er even hide anything from it. In a remote place near the lake, Fan Xian finally asked about the topic of the night. From the moonlight, very casually, it was quietly hidden in the forest. I hear that the head of receiving the night breeze from the lake is very powerful. It was the middle of the night when no one was whispering. Yes. In the tent, it was not a young couple were whispering to each other. She snuggled in his arms and gently rubbed her face. Chapter 119. Eunuch Hong has been the royal palace since the founding of the finding out that you carried when the previous emperor was on the throne. She sleeps. He was trusted so deeply. Today he still maintains. I don't even need to use as the head of the eunuchs. But he is she'll wake up and doesn't care. But it's a bit embarrassing. He basically stays in the Empress Dowager's Can you believe what you say? In the Empress Dowager's Then what are you going to do, Wan'er? Fan Xian looked at her face, suddenly surged with many dark. The moonlight outside the tent was not. What is it? So Lin Wan'er's face was particularly hazy, two large eyes. Lin Wan'er wrinkled her pretty nose, pinched the tip of her cold nose, and smiled. What can I do if I let a big pervert? It's just that if I want to have a good relationship with the royal palace, Fan Xian, I have to do something about you. I'm also worried that that won't be necessary. Sneaking around like Lin Wan'er explained. After we get married, this old eunuch only walks around the royal. I don't know how to use the door. He doesn't care much. What should I do then? Fan Xian couldn't tell the woman in his arms. She was afraid that his thoughts would really turn to evil. Leave a message for me. It was the dead of night when the royal palace the two of them were alone. Lin Wan'er really wanted to do something, but she didn't forget to stop him. I think it would be Fan Xian didn't know the girl's thoughts. Are you in a hurry? If he knew that Lin, of course I'm in a hurry, was already with such a good daughter-in-law to stop him, who wouldn't be in a hurry? Probably have leapt forward a long time ago. The second the saying goes, the building in the royal palace returned to silence. But it's that it's not. Looking at his fiancée, in Fan Xian's soundly in his arms. Once a girl thought Fan Xian unconsciously sighed. Then she was already. There were always many other things in life. The two of them lay on the soft mattress. Well. The mosquito net was pulled open. The next day, looking out, they could see the temple for morning attendance. The moon was dim, so the stars were pulled him to one side in the dark night with a hint of blue. Do you know about that? They gently watched. Fan Xian looked at the man's 30 or 40-year-old reclined in Fan which still had traces of the handsomeness of the past. Fan Xian only smelled a light fragrance. What matter? His chest and abdomen with a girl's. The office of the Grand Herald sent a message this morning. The summer youths saying that they want to transfer you over there. As if there was no office of the Grand Herald was responsible for receiving any man who had yet to respond and handling matters regardless of whether he was 16 or 60. Fan Xian was had already fallen to the stage. He knew that the matter the Crown Prince was talking about had begun. Fan Xian cupped his hands and tightened his arms. Sir, bringing the two of them to be transferred over there. not
I've only
leaving
been at
any
Taichung
distance
Temple
between
for a
them.
dozen days.
Confused
Rin
or
Xiaoqing
blissful.
frowned.
He felt
Does her
every
fan have
bit
any
of touch
connections in
and
the Eastern Palace?
elasticity in his arms.
Fan Xian knew that he was
Xian
asking about his
began to
father.
perform magic.
He shook his head.
His right hand
You know
had
that
been
my
holding
father
one Er's
rarely
hand,
interacts
but in the
with
next
palace.
moment, it
Not
had
even
somehow
with ministers.
run to the girl's
That's true.
thin clothes.
Vice Minister Rin
The
nodded.
tent was
Count Sinan
incomparably
was
quiet,
famous for his
and
stubbornness.
even the slight sound
Taking
of the waves
advantage
on
of the
lake
special
seemed
relationship he
extremely
had with the
bashful.
emperor.
After
He didn't
a long
even pay
time,
attention to
a
the
few
prime minister in
shameful
the past,
voices came from the tent
and was always on
along with the
equal footing with
intoxicated
the other
voice of the
princes.
young man.
Rin
There are
Xiaoqing
always
thought
some
for a
things in the
moment.
world that
I
cannot
heard
be
that the
seen
Eastern
with
Palace
one's
suggested
eyes.
that you
It
participate
is really difficult
in this
to
negotiation.
grasp. Very
Fan
difficult
Xian
to
didn't know how to
grasp.
respond.
Lin
So he
Wanner's
continued to
ears
play
were
dumb.
red.
What
And she made a
negotiation?
sound of agreement.
The envoy from Northern Xi
She
is
twisted
here
her body
to
to
discuss
free
the
herself
aftermath
from
of the war
Fan
between the
Xian's
vassal
demonic
states of
grasp.
the northern frontier.
But she was no
such as
match
the
for the
payment of money.
explosive power.
The envoy
of the
from
Virgin.
Dongyi,
Her body
is
was
here to deal with the
teased until it
assassination
became
attempt
more
on the
and
second
more
son
lit.
of the prime
In her
minister at the foot
desperation,
of the Tsang
she
Mountains.
coughed.
I heard
and
that he brought a
forced
lot
herself
of
to look
money
weak.
and beautiful
As
women.
expected,
The so-called
Fan Xian was
negotiation
startled
is to see how the
thinking that she had
imperial
caught a
court
cold.
haggles with
He
these two
hurriedly
places.
recited the
Rin
heart-cleansing
Xiao
kindness mantra
and was the prime
a
minister's
few
disciple.
times to
So he
suppress
naturally
his
saw
desires.
Fan Xian.
He
as
straightened
one
her
of his own.
clothes.
He cautiously
and pulled the
reminded
blanket
him.
over her.
If this
Lin
matter
Wanner's
is handled
embarrassment
well,
had not
it will
yet
only
faded,
be the icing
but she
on the
felt a
cake.
little
In
amused
any
and
case,
touched.
the soldiers have
Afraid that he would
sacrificed their
change
lives
again,
to conquer
she rolled
those
her
territories
eyes
and changed.
But if it is not handled
today
well,
by Jian,
and we don't
I saw
get
that
the
you meant some
benefits
fresh
that the emperor
things.
expects,
If I were to sell
then it will
them,
be very
I'm afraid they
inappropriate.
would sell for a
As
lot.
for Dongyi,
right?
This matter
She was
involves
talking
the
about
death
the
of the
barbecue
second son.
condiments. If
And
you
the
are too
tent
weak,
they were currently
it will be
living
difficult to
Fan
explain
Xian was
yourself
now
to the prime
a little
minister.
dissatisfied.
But since the imperial
He said in a
court has
hoarse
allowed
voice,
the Dongyi
"You are a
envoy
princess.
to come,
Why are you
proves that
worrying
the
about
imperial
such a
court
small
doesn't
amount of
want to
money?
pursue this matter
Come,
too much.
let's kiss again.
They only want to get some
Lin
benefits.
Wanner was both
After all,
embarrassed and
Dongyi
anxious.
still has Sigurd.
You open a bookstore,
Fan
and you
Xian
make
frowned.
tofu.
These
People
matters
think you
were
like to do
indeed
business.
complicated.
Fan
Rin
Xian
Xiao
thought
and
that making
continued
tofu
with
was
concern.
one thing,
Your identity
but eating
is
tofu was
special.
another.
You
He
and the
replied
prime
with a
minister
pained
are about to
expression.
become
I have to
father
prove
and
that I can
son-in-law.
make money.
Only then will our uncle,
If you try to
the
cater
emperor,
to the emperor's
be
wishes,
at ease when
you
he
will
leaves
lose
the
your
palace
father's
treasury
wishes.
to us to manage.
So this is a very
After
awkward
he entered the
situation.
capital,
You
he
must
had focused on
careful.
doing business
Fan
and
Xian was
befriended
startled.
Qingyu Hall.
Only
for this
then did
matter.
he realize
the two of them had
crux of the
finally
matter.
calmed down.
He gratefully
They hugged
cupped
each
his
other,
hands and saluted.
gazed at the stars. And
I am
chatted
new to
idly.
officialdom.
Somehow,
I
they
don't know
began
the
to talk about
intricacies of
Fan
this,
Xian's
but
visit
this matter
to
is
the
a bit
prime minister's
complicated.
manor. A few
I'm only
days
an
ago.
8th level
Father,
functionary.
is he well?
Even if the office
Lin
of the
Wanner
Herald of
asked with
Ceremonies
concern.
sends me to assist,
She rarely saw her father.
I fear that my
but
words
she still
will
missed
carry
him.
little weight.
Today,
Rin
she had
Xiao
seen her foolish
shook his
brother
head and sighed.
Thought,
This time you're the
second
deputy
brother,
envoy.
Lin Gong.
You are at the peak
had
of the
died
storm.
young. Who knows
Her
how many
father was
eyes are
alone,
watching you? And he must have been
Why are they
very
watching
sad.
me?
As a
Thinking
son,
this,
Fan
she was
Xian
unable to
smiled
serve
and
him.
said, Fan
You
Xian
worry
knew
too
what she was
much,
thinking.
sir.
He
There should be
comforted
no
her.
problem.
He's fine.
Indeed,
After we get
Rin
married,
Xiao,
we can
had
be
worried
filled
too
together.
much.
It's
Although
better
he
than
didn't
now.
know what the
Oh,
Eastern
right.
Palace meant,
The Prime
by
Minister has
sending
really
him to be
agreed
the
to our
deputy
marriage.
envoy.
Their
Whether it was
voices
to rope him
grew
in
lower
or to make
and
him
lower
lose the
until they
emperor's
could not be
wishes.
heard.
Fan
They
Xian had
disappeared
already
into the
made
quiet
sufficient
night
preparations
by the lake. He was
As
not
for
afraid.
what else happened that
In the
night,
afternoon,
they would have to think
an
about it
official
later.
sedan
The next
chair
day
came to
the
pick him
sky
up.
was bright.
It traveled
It was
along
impossible
the
for the
bluestone
two of
path,
them to still
and
be
in
in
less
their
than a
tents.
quarter of an hour,
Otherwise,
the
sedan
sedan
chair
and maids
entered
found
the
out that
office
their
of the Herald
mistress
of
and future
Ceremonies.
master had been
The office
affectionate
of the Herald of
outside
Ceremonies
all night.
was
It would
equivalent
certainly
to the
become the most
Ministry of
sensational
Foreign
gossip
Affairs of
in
later
the capital.
generations.
Fan
The minister
Xian
of the
and
office
Lin
of the
Wanner
Herald of
opened their
Ceremonies
eyes on their
was
respective
equivalent
beds.
to the minister
They rubbed
of
their
Foreign
eyes,
Affairs.
turned over,
In his previous
smiled,
life,
reminisced,
Fan Xian
and
believed in the
foolishly
saying,
stretched their
"A weak
bodies.
country has
After
no
everyone got up,
diplomacy."
they began
Now,
to
that
eat
the kingdom
at
of
separate
Qing
tables.
was the most
The
powerful
maids and
country in the
servants
world.
busied
The
themselves.
office of the Herald of Ceremonies had
Lin
become
Wanner
a
sat
very
at the round
lucrative
table
and
gently putting
prestigious
shredded pickled
surrounded by
vegetables
dense
into
cypress
Debeo's bowl of
trees. Euphoric. The summer she did not even glance penetrate the yamen at all. On the other
Fan
side,
Fan
smiled foolishly and
listening
blew
to
at
the
his
man
sister's
above
bowl
him speak.
to cool it down.
The speaker
It
was
seemed like a
Exine
special
Shuwu,
brother-sister bond.
the vice-envoy
Fan
of the office of the
and
herald
Lin
of
Wanner did
ceremonies.
not look at each
Northern
other,
Shi
but there was
and
some kind of
Donnie had
emotion
come to
between
deliver
their
their
letters of credence.
The whole hall
To the
began to
officials
emit
of the
smell
kingdom of
happiness.
Qin, who were
The
used to being
sensitive
the boss.
Yulinger,
This
and
was
the
not a very
intelligent
big
Fan,
deal.
Ro
So the vice-envoy of the
looked at each
office
other
of the herald of
suspiciously,
ceremonies
and then
was
tacitly
still
averted
sleeping
their
their
gaze.
gazes. The person
It
in
was still
charge of
early.
this matter was
After
only
eating,
a fourth-rank
Fan Xian was about to
vice-envoy.
find a secluded
Master
place
Fan,
in the woods
this
to
time,
exercise
the court
and
appointed
maintain
you
his daily
as the
practice.
deputy envoy.
To his surprise,
First, it is
Yulinger
because of your
walked up to
talent,
him and
cupped her
second,
fists,
the matter
and
of
asked for
Northern
his
Qi
guidance.
has something to do with
After Yulinger
It is just
returned
that
to
you're
the
not
manor,
familiar
she
with
told her
these
father
matters,
about the contest
so there's no need to
outside
rush.
the royal courtyard.
Take your time. Yizhong
Exine
asked about it
Shuwu
in
knew that
detail,
the beautiful
and
young
praised
man
Fan
sitting
Xian's
at the very
response.
bottom
He
had a
said that
powerful
Master Fan
background.
had been able to
So he
evade
spoke
the
very
assassination
politely.
attempt,
and
Yes,
cut
yes.
open
Master
Chang
Fan.
Jushu. Your
He was
poetry
indeed
is
extraordinary.
famous throughout the capital.
Hearing her father's
Coming
words,
to our office,
Yi
Linger
Linger
was
was
finally convinced
to reason with those
Fanxian's
foreigners
abilities is a
but
waste
she
of your
adhered to
talent.
the
A
ideals
large
of the
group
Yi
of
family,
officials looked
and
at
whenever she found an
Fanxian,
opportunity,
quietly
she would
flattering him.
sincerely ask Fanxian for guidance.
At the same time,
asking for guidance,
they were afraid that
only
this young
proved
master
that Yi
would
Linger
steal
was
all
not
the credit
convinced
from
to
the
the
office
bone.
of the herald of
Fanxian
ceremonies.
rarely trained
They
with
couldn't
others,
help but
back
look a
in
little
Danzhou.
embarrassed.
He was a pitiful character who was beaten by Uncle Wu Zhu. So today,
Chapter
he had the right to give
123.
advice to Yi
Fanxian
Linger,
did not dare to be
seventh-level
careless.
master. He quickly
He could
stood
not
up
help
and
but
bowed,
feel a little
then
happy.
cupped his hands and
His words of
saluted.
advice were
He looked at the
sincere,
diplomatic
but Wu
officials
Zhu
of the
was
kingdom
not
of
a good
Qing
teacher,
with a warm
and
expression
neither was
and said
Fanxian.
sincerely,
He could only tell her how to
I have only
punch
been in
straight
Taichung
and
Temple
how to
for a
save
few
energy.
days.
He could
and I do
only
not
start
even
from the
understand the
surface,
music of the court.
and
The
could not
palace
sum up a
appointed
complete
me
theory.
as deputy.
The so-called little tricks
presumably
were
to let the
Fanxian's
northern Qi
current
rebels
set of
see
killing
that the
techniques.
people of the Qing
But it was not
kingdom
convenient to
cannot
teach
be
them to
casually
others.
killed.
They only want me to be a
To a
memorial.
beautiful girl with
They don't
eyes
actually
as
want me
clear
to
as
do
jade.
anything.
Besides,
negotiations.
Fanxian was not an
He
honest
chuckled
person who would
and
dig
continued,
out the heart of
I know
anyone he
nothing
met.
about the relations
So it was
between
impossible for
nations.
Yi Linger
I only
to
hope
learn
that
the
I will not
essence
be a
of
hindrance
Wu
to you.
Zhu's killing
I hope you will
techniques.
not hesitate
But in
to
the
enlighten
end,
me.
she had made
After
some
all,
progress. He was not someone who had been in the
Fanxian smiled.
bureaucracy for a long
Today,
time.
he had finally seen the
Fanxian's
Yi
words were a
family's
bit
lien
excessive
sans
and
reckless.
clearly.
But this kind
It
of
turned out that a
straightforward
simple
speech
pair of
actually
hands
made
could
the
evolve
officials of the
into
chamberlain
so
of the
many
penitencies
attacking methods.
feel very
Even Yi Linger had the power to
Originally,
break through
when
the
they
wind
learned that
and
Assistant
kill
Minister
gods.
Fansun was
If it
going
had
to
been Yi
participate
Zhong
in the
or Yi Lin
negotiations,
himself, perhaps
these
the coffin breaker
self-proclaimed
would have been enough to
professionals
break
of
the
the stone
kingdom
tomb
of Qing,
and the Sanzhou
always felt a
Sanzhou
little
would have been like a
uncomfortable.
withered twig.
It was like a group
making it
carrying
impossible
crows,
for the opponent
and suddenly
to
a
dodge.
vulture
After a
had
series
flown
of
in
punches
for a
and
bone.
palms.
Since Fanxian had made it
was
clear that
very
he was not
satisfied
here
with
with
the
the
degree
degree
of
of
flexibility
the people of
of Yi
Honglu
Linger's
Temple
body.
were
But
naturally
the way
much
he looked at her
happier.
slender waist with a
Xianchu
smile
also
was a
nodded
little
his head in
strange.
approval. Of course, everyone knew that if they could successfully demarcate the border, they would be able to obtain a large amount of tribute silver and be rewarded accordingly. This nobleman, who was clearly here to gild his name, would certainly receive what he deserved. After the meeting, Xianchu led Fanxian to a small room that had been prepared for him. He pointed to a large cabinet filled with documents and said, "The relevant information is all here. The most important thing in this negotiation is that Northern Qi wants to give some silver in exchange for a large piece of land, which we have already occupied. Dongyi does not have any requests. They only want to settle the last two assassinations. The first is the Nyolan Street incident related to Fanxian. The two female assassins have already been proven to be the disciples of Sigu Jian's second disciple. The second is the matter of the manor at the foot of Song Mountain, but he looked at Fanxian and paused for a moment before continuing. As you know, that matter is a bit complicated, so the court will not be able to come up with any good evidence." Fanxian nodded. Smelling the stale air in the room, he began to feel a headache coming on. Would he have to deal with these things for the next few days? As if reading his mind, Vice-Chancellor Xan smiled and said, "If Master Fan does not wish to stay on duty, you may take it home with you. But you are not allowed to take a single step out of the yamen, as long as it is marked in red." Fanxian was overjoyed. Although he knew that the old man did not want to see him as an eyesore, he still gratefully said, "To tell the truth, I have no idea why I came here today. If you do not mind my laziness, I am willing to sleep at home every day." For a mere 8th-level functionary to make such a joke with a 4th-level vice minister of Honglu Temple, Fanxian reckoned he was a rare anomaly in the Qing kingdom. Xianchu paused for a moment before bursting into laughter. He lowered his voice and said, "Master Fan, the Eastern Palace has high hopes for you." Fanxian smiled. Now that he knew who Xianchu was, he did not dare to be vague. He quickly replied, "Please do not worry, sir. I understand. My father often teaches his sons that as an official, I must abide by the rules of an official." Hearing this reply, Xianchu, who was the crown prince's confidant, nodded with satisfaction. "Count Sinan is devoted to the country. I have always admired him." The two of them exchanged a few more indifferent words before Vice-Chancellor Xian left. Fanxian watched him leave and gradually narrowed his eyes. His father had indeed said that as long as the crown prince was on the throne, the Fan family would naturally be loyal to the crown prince. But even Fanxian himself did not believe these words.
Xian Shiwu, who was clearly a member of the Eastern Palace, would not believe it so easily. Appointing Fan Xian as deputy envoy was only a cautious attempt by the Eastern Palace to see if the Fan family could move a little closer to the Crown Prince's throne, even if it was just a little. In the following dozen days, Fan Xian did as he said. Every day, he shut himself in the manor and slept. Of course, for him, sleeping itself was a necessary process of cultivation. As for the official matters, after he took back some information, he handed it over to Wang Qinian and let him make the decision to come up with a proper negotiation plan. Fan Xian knew very well that Wang Qinian would secretly report to the old cripple of the Overwatch Council. Since that was the case, he handed over this complicated and boring task to Wang Qinian. Whether it was for the sake of his mother or his father, Qin Pingping could not allow Fan Xian to lose face in court. Of course, he would handle it appropriately. When it came to using resources that he could use, he did not hold back. As expected, a few days later, Wang Qinian came to the small room they had agreed upon, looking haggard. He handed over a thick folder. Fan Xian curiously opened it, and his eyes lit up. He saw that it was divided into two parts. One was the internal reference material that only the high-ranking officials of the Office of the Grand Herald were allowed to see, and the other was the prepared file on the negotiations with Northern Qi. The material clearly analyzed the internal situation of Northern Qi, including the scheming between the young emperor and the Empress Dowager, Imperial Advisor Ku, he being a pacifist, and so on. The material clearly stated that the Empress Dowager's younger brother, the Marquis of Ning, had been attacked by the civil officials of Northern Qi because of his defeat. Thus, the young emperor did not care how much money he had to pay or how much land he had to cut off. As long as the people were angry, he could use this opportunity to weaken the power of the Empress Dowager. Because the Empress Dowager was anxious to calm things down and free up her hands to reorganize the court, her instructions for this negotiation were mainly to be patient. Of course, these things hidden in the dark could not be seen by the foreign officials of the Qin Kingdom. Only the secret power of the Overwatch Council, through spies all over Northern Qi, could find out every little thing, and then put them together and analyze them, could come to such a clear conclusion. Wonderful! Fan Xian sighed. With this information in hand, the officials of the Office of the Grand Herald will be laughing their heads off. He paused, then asked curiously, "How reliable is this information?" The corners of Wang Qinian's eyes drooped. It seemed that he had not slept well for the past few days. Very reliable. Yin Bingyun has already made a name for himself in Northern Qi, and the entire intelligence network is very reasonable. With mutual reference, there should be no problem. Fan Xian could not help but feel some respect for the young man, called Yin Bingyun. For the sake of the country, he was content to be a rat in the shadows, and he had done so for many years. As the son of a high-ranking official in the court, it was not easy. How could he know that the reason Yin Bingyun was pitifully staying in Northern Qi was because of the attempted assassination when Fan Xian was 12 years old? If Fan Xian knew about this, he did not know whether he would feel guilty or laugh out loud. Wang Qinian, I didn't expect you to be so good at intelligence analysis as well as tracking. Fan Xian knew exactly where this dossier had come from, but he did not point it out. Wang Qinian could only return the courtesy, not daring to claim credit. Fine, I'll go to the Office of the Grand Herald tomorrow and discuss this with the Vice Minister. Fan Xian saw that Wang Qinian seemed to want to say something and asked curiously, "Is there anything else?" Wang Qinian said awkwardly, "Sir, this information cannot be given to the Office of the Grand Herald." Why? Because the secrets involved are of the highest level. The entire Office of the Grand Herald, including the Minister of the Grand Herald, has no right to access them. Fan Xian slapped his forehead and laughed bitterly. Then what do you think we should do? Let the council go through normal channels and give it directly to the Office of the Grand Herald. Wang Qinian sighed. If it were not for the fact that the director wanted Fan Xian to astonish everyone in the negotiations and pave the way for his future career, he would not have ordered the entire 6th Bureau to work through the night to write this dossier. This dossier looked ordinary, but contained the blood, sweat, and tears of the Overwatch Council's intelligence analysts. If Fan Xian were to simply give it to the office of the Grand Herald, the director would probably jump out of his wheelchair in anger. It was the end of summer, and the heat was still hot. The people on the streets of the capital and the black dogs on the streets were somewhat dispirited by the weather. On the 8th day of the 8th month, an auspicious day, the Northern Qi and Dongyi envoys arrived at the last official resting place to the northwest of the capital. The Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing had personally issued an edict allowing the two envoys to stay in the Emperor's palace. The protocol officials of the three sides argued for a few days and finally decided on a schedule and arrangements for their arrival in the capital. The people of the capital were all roused. They felt that in their ordinary and boring lives, there had suddenly been an autumn rain. In their minds, the envoys of these two countries were not here to negotiate, but to present their letters of surrender. As the deputy envoy for negotiations, Fan Xian was naturally part of the group that welcomed the envoys. From the west gate of the capital, he waited for the officials of the two countries and arranged for them to stay in the official resting place. The faces of the Northern Qi envoys were clearly unsightly. After all, they had been the losers in this battle of commanding the vassal states. Furthermore, many of their soldiers had been captured, and most importantly, a lot of their land had been occupied. "Sir, who is this?" The highest-ranking official in the Northern Qi envoys was the younger brother of the current empress, Chang Ningho. He looked down at the handsome young man from above, and his heart was filled with anger. The kingdom of Qing did not value him. The official receiving him was only a minor official from the office of the Grand Herald, and yet they had allowed such a young man to be the deputy envoy. It could not be helped that they were looking down on him. "I am Fan Xian. Greetings, Master Marquis." Fan Xian's face was full of smiles as he looked at the enemy. The intelligence report from the Overwatch Council in his bosom made it clear that this man was just a decoration. The man in the sedan behind him, Zhuang Mohan, was the real deal. He had been arranged by the palace to live in a side courtyard. Chapter 124. Compared to the citizens of the capital who were waiting to see what was going on, Fan Xian was in low spirits. He was carefully writing a few notes in his study, doing his best to rewrite the Overwatch Council's intelligence analysis report. Using the tone of a young master who had lived in the capital for a long time, he rewrote it into a slightly scholarly judgment. This was to prevent the jaws of the officials of the office of the Grand Herald from dropping to the ground when they heard his report. They would suspect that, besides the Emperor's Overwatch Council, the Kingdom of Qing had another terrifying intelligence agency, and that this agency was working for a mere 8th-level functionary. Fan Ro wasn't in a good mood either. She copied it in small script and stuck the slip of paper together. "Brother, this is really strange. Where did you get this information? Why didn't you just use it? Why did you have to make it sound so ridiculous?" Fan Xian rarely hid anything from his sister. In this regard, even Lin Wan'er could not compare to Ruo. He said bitterly, "At first, I was just being lazy, so I wanted to borrow their power. Who would have thought that I would create such a meticulous and terrifying case? The source of this information cannot see the light of day, so I couldn't just hand it over to the office of the Grand Herald." Who is the envoy from Northern Qi this time? Fan Ro was actually very happy that her brother could finally openly participate in court politics. Although Fan Xian had taught her since she was very young, she was still a girl who had grown up in the world of the Kingdom of Qing. She had always thought that a man who made tofu every day could only be treated as entertainment and could not be sustained for long. Not the Emperor's party, not the Empress Dowager's party, and certainly not the Crown Prince's party. As Fan Xian sorted out the information on the table, he casually replied, "It is the Northern Qi Empress's brother, Chang Ningho. I hear he's also a great scholar. But this time, the most eye-catching person in the Northern Qi envoy is not him, but his teacher. Northern Qi's literary master of a generation is called Zhuang Mohan. As long as one is a scholar, he is greatly admired. I don't know what price Northern Qi paid to pull him into the envoy. When the time comes, even His Majesty will have to give him some face. I'm afraid this butcher style of demanding land and money will have to be toned down a bit. Zhuang Mohan? Fan Ruo was shocked, and her face glowed. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his sister look like a star chaser. Ruo had always been a very cold woman. Aside from her brother, who she adored, she had never paid any attention to other scholars. For some reason, Fan Xian felt a little jealous. Fortunately, the case file clearly states that this Zhuang Mohan is already 70 years old. Otherwise, I would have to be a little more careful. Fan Ruo said shyly, "As a brother, how can you not be serious?" Fan Xian laughed and said, "If you really like that old man, then you are the one who is not proper." Seeing that Ruo was about to get angry, he quickly waved his hand and said, "Let's be serious. Do you have any ideas about what I told you that day at the country estate?" That night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The brother and sister were sitting in the field worrying about the little girl's future marriage. Ruo fretted for a while, but in the end, not a single one of the four young talents caught her eye, so she gave up. At that moment, Fan Xian thought of something and frowned. Last time, when we coincidentally met His Majesty at the Lu Jing River, didn't he say something? What did he say? Fan Ruo showed a rare, confused expression. It seemed that the brother and sister were too shocked at the time, and their memories were a little fuzzy. Fan Xian closed his eyes for a long time. Suddenly, he opened them and slapped the table. "His Majesty wants to arrange a marriage for you." Fan Ruo was quite frightened. What were the children of officials most afraid of? Marriage. If they were lucky, like Lin Wan, they would be married to Fan Xian. If they were like Taichung Temple's Ran Shaoqing, who was married to a tigress princess, they would not be happy for the rest of their lives. And of all the marriage arrangements, the most frightening was the one that came from the palace. The emperor's will could not be disobeyed. Even if you were to marry a hedonistic son of a rich family, you would not be able to reason with him. In the past, officials and eunuchs still had the possibility of sending their daughters to the palace to win the emperor's favor. But this emperor was not interested in women, so this path was blocked. Even the crown prince and the two adult princes did not dare to take more than one concubine. Although the crown prince's lecherous reputation was known throughout the capital, there were only 3 cold and lonely concubines in the Eastern Palace. Fan Ruo also remembered the emperor's seemingly unintentional words. She was quite shocked, and tears welled up in her eyes. "What should we do?" she asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian's mind worked quickly, and he immediately came up with a few possible families. He narrowed his eyes and said, "The great prince, the second prince, and the crown prince of King Jing. Although my father is only an assistant minister, based on the Fan family's position, the emperor will probably only choose one of these 3. If he chooses one of the minister's sons, then there is nothing to be afraid of. If you are not willing, I naturally have a way to reject this marriage." If the marriage was to be arranged to the son of a minister, and his sister was not willing, Fan Xian would naturally think of many ways. After all, behind him stood his father, Chun Pingping, and the prime minister. They were the so-called 3 powerful people, and even the crown prince of the Eastern Palace was trying to rope him in. As long as it was not one of the 2 princes or crown prince Jing, Fan Xian was confident that he could ruin all the marriages his sister did not want. However, the 3 young nobles were most likely to be the ones who were the most powerful. Fan Xian was quiet for a moment, and then suddenly couldn't help but curse. I was wondering why Li Hongcheng went to the brothel every day but refused to get married. So he was waiting here. Seeing his sister's frightened expression, Fan Xian smiled and comforted her. "The eldest prince has been fighting in the Western barbarians for many years, and I hear he is also outstanding in martial arts. Although I have never met the second prince, I hear he is also a very powerful person. As for Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongcheng, the 2 of us are familiar with each other. Aside from his somewhat playful nature, there is nothing bad about him. If you really do marry Li Hongcheng with me on your side, I won't even let him take a concubine into his room, let alone a brothel. Don't worry, sister." It would have been better if he hadn't comforted her. Now that he had analyzed the situation, Ruo felt more and more certain that it was true, as if it was about to happen. She said sorrowfully, "Brother, but I don't want to marry any of these three." Fan Xian sighed. He didn't want to continue discussing the troubles of growing up. In a gentle voice, he teased, "What's so bad about that? When I see you in the future, I'll have to call you a concubine or something. If the second prince really does become emperor, and you're the mother of the world, wouldn't that make you my mother?" This joke was not very funny, so Ro didn't laugh through her tears. There was an awkward silence in the study. In the silence, the brother and sister both had their own worries. Ruo was confused, while Fan Xian was determined. If something really did happen in the future, he had to prepare for it. The location for the negotiations was not very spacious. It was set up in the largest room in Honlu Temple. There was no extremely long table between the Northern Qi envoy and the Qing official. Instead, it was as if they were having a casual chat. They sat in their respective chairs, with tea on the table, and chatted as if they were having a casual conversation. Fan Xian insisted on sitting in the most inconspicuous chair at the bottom. He looked at the scene with cold eyes and thought of a phrase from his previous life, tea party. Although he was nominally the deputy envoy, because the process had not yet entered the final stage, and he insisted on sitting below, the official from Honlu Temple couldn't do anything. Under the gentle exchange of words, there was a hidden glint of swords. Before long, the voices of the officials of the two countries, who had already seen the outcome of the battle, gradually grew louder. Some of the more impatient officials' buttocks were about to leave the surface of their chairs. "Oof. I don't know whether Northern Qi won this battle on the northern border, or our court won." A sixth-level official registrar of the Honlu Temple could no longer tolerate the other party's unreasonable words. He stood up and sternly rebuked them. "Battles are dangerous. His Majesty of Northern Qi is worried about his subjects and people, and so he benevolently and righteously stopped the battle. Victory and defeat have not been decided, so how can we know who the winner is? If the envoy of Northern Qi was not thick-skinned, he would not have been sent to be the vanguard." Seeing the mustache man speak as if it were a matter of course, even the usually calm Fan Xian wanted to rush forward and beat him up. Xian Shuwu of the Honlu Temple smiled slightly, but Fan Xian could see a trace of treachery in his smile. This treachery was the confidence that the Qing kingdom had accumulated through 20 years of victories. He heard the high-ranking official of the Qing kingdom say quietly, "In that case, please return. Between our two countries, we will fight again. After a true victory has been decided, it will not be too late to negotiate." What was this? This was an undisguised threat. This was undisguised state terrorism. This was undisguised hooliganism. Fan Xian did not show any shock on his face, but in his heart, he was incomparably impressed. This Xian Shuwu is quite daring. As expected, as soon as he said this, the Northern Qi side began to attack the Qing officials for speaking carelessly, causing irreparable damage to the friendship between the two countries. Unexpectedly, Xian Shuwu continued to coldly reply, "Between our two countries, when has there ever been such a thing as friendship? This is probably how Wei Xiaobao negotiates." Fan Xian clicked his tongue in his heart. A high-ranking official of the Honlu Temple was acting like a scoundrel in the relationship between the two countries. If it were not for the fact that the kingdom of Qing was truly powerful, this situation would never have occurred. The negotiations of the Honlu Temple had always been well-coordinated. The red-faced and black-faced officials took turns to take the stage, and as expected, another official stood up with a face full of benevolence. "Everyone, do not forget your duties. Do not let your emotions affect His Majesty's original intention of restoring the friendship between our two countries." The two sides brushed their sleeves and left, and the tea party ended. The high-ranking officials had already revealed their identities, and the actual fighting at the negotiating table was left to the lower-ranking officials, who worked hard to do it. But the negotiations had reached an impasse, and for the time being, they could not move forward. As for the Northern Qi envoy, Zhuang Mohan, after entering the palace to speak with the Empress Dowager, He rarely came out to see people. Fan Xian was a little puzzled. Was that old man here on vacation? Chapter 125. 2 days later, in the office of the Grand Herald. Exchanging captives is the first major event. Xian Chiwu was no longer as reckless as when the two countries were negotiating. He said lightly, "His Majesty has decreed that the captured soldiers must be returned no matter what. Everything else is trivial. We might as well make some concessions in this regard." An official replied, "The number of people captured from northern Qi and the small countries they control has been roughly tallied. There are more than 2,400 people. On our side, about 1,000 people were captured, according to His Majesty's decree. Even if we were to exchange our captives, we would still be able to get them back." Yes, Xian Chiwu nodded, satisfied with his subordinate's efficiency. Regarding the issue of redrawing the border, His Majesty's intentions are clear. We will not give up an inch of the land we have taken. If northern Qi wants it, they will have to exchange it with the grasslands of Qianlong Bay. Qianlong Bay was in the northwest of the Kingdom of Qing, and it was connected to the only enclave of the Kingdom of Qing there. If they could take it back, that enclave would be safe. The officials noted down their superiors' intentions. One of them said, "But for some reason, northern Qi has been particularly unyielding this time. It seems they want to fight to the death. They have only agreed to give us money and horses, but they are not willing to cede the land." The first person to jump out at the tea party was an impulsive person. He slammed the table and scolded, "We have already taken the land. Are we going to have to give it back?" Xian Chiwu nodded. Although Master Zhao's words are a bit direct, they do make sense. He coldly glanced at his subordinates, put down the teacup in his hand, and said, "My fellow colleagues, don't forget that these lands were won by our soldiers with swords and spears. They were exchanged with blood and flesh. Of course, we can't give them back with both hands. Those soldiers have paid with their lives. What about us? We are only moving our lips, so we cannot give up on the interests of our own countries. We must fight with them for a tale of silver and an inch of land." The man who had spoken earlier continued to frown. "What you say is very true, sir. But according to the secret reports from the envoys stationed in Shangjing, the relationship between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi has become warmer because of this defeat. Furthermore, the Empress Dowager's brother has already been punished and returned home. If we ask for too much in the negotiations, and the two countries go to war again after a breakdown, this would not be in line with His Majesty's wishes. Everyone should know that if Northern Qi is truly of one mind, even a centipede with 100 legs would not feel good if it bit someone. Shangjing of Northern Qi is too far away. Going there and back, this information might not be useful." Xian Chiwu felt a headache coming on. The most important thing in negotiations was to know yourself and your enemy. Although they had the home advantage and the advantage of being the victor, the other side was in their own capital. They could rely on the Northern Qi spy network that the court had not yet had time to clean up. They could have first-hand information on the Qing court's reaction, but it would be difficult for the Qing side to know the true reaction of the Northern Qi court. Someone suggested, "Why don't we ask His Majesty to have the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council assist us? You should know that the people of the 4th Bureau in Northern Qi are much more powerful than those of the other yamans of the court." Everyone's eyes brightened. This was true. As officials of the capital, of course they feared and hated the Overwatch Council. But if the mad dog, the Overwatch Council, was used to deal with the enemy, no one would object. They would all be in favor of it. Unexpectedly, hearing this suggestion, Xian Chiwu suddenly lost his poise. He scolded, "What you have thought of, haven't I and the prefect not thought of it? If Yin Luo Jian doesn't want to give us anything, what can I do? Do I have to go cry in front of His Majesty's palace?" So that was how it was. Their faces became calm again, but deep down they thought, if you can get information on Northern Qi, what is there to be afraid of crying on the stone steps in front of Xingqing Palace? The hall fell silent. Although the officials and people of the Qing kingdom had always thought of themselves as the strongest country in the world,
before His Majesty ascended the throne, the people of the Qin Kingdom had always lived under the terrifying shadow of Northern Wei. Although Northern Wei had been reduced to half of its territory by His Majesty on 3 northern expeditions, becoming the Northern Qi of today, if they were forced into a corner again, it would still be a terrifying thing. So without the support of strong confidence, the negotiations seemed to be stuck in a stalemate. Tonight, I will go to the palace again to ask for His Majesty's decree. Xian Chiwu frowned, but his eyes glanced at Fan Xian, who had been sitting quietly at the end. Fan Xian seemed to have no self-awareness as a deputy. These days, whether it was negotiations or anything else, he always sat there with a smile on his face. No one knew what he was thinking. Xian Chiwu had been sent here by the Crown Prince's edict to give Fan Xian some political capital. Fan Xian was sensible enough not to take credit, but it was not good for him to be so silent. He thought for a moment, then said gently, "Master Fan, what do you think of this?" Fan Xian clenched his fists in his sleeves, but his face remained calm. He said gently, "I think that Northern Qi is just bluffing. If they really have the strength to fight again, they would not be in such a hurry to send a diplomatic mission to sue for peace." The officials all knew that Master Fan was famous for his poetry and fists, and they had admired his quiet and unambitious attitude these days, so they had some expectations of what he would say. But when they found out that he could only say such a general statement, they could not help but feel disappointed. But for the sake of face, the officials could not say anything, so they casually agreed. Xian Chiwu, on the other hand, thought that since he was going to do Fan Xian a favor, he might as well do it thoroughly. He continued to ask gently, "What you say is reasonable, but in the relationship between two countries, what is real is fake, and what is fake is real. A country is like a person, and sometimes it is dominated by emotions, so it cannot be judged by reason. Do you have any other evidence, Deputy Fan?" He really did hope that Fan Xian could strengthen the conviction of the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. Fan Xian inwardly praised the Vice Minister for saying that a country is like a person. He thought for a moment, then said, "The key is that Zhuang Mohan. You all know his position in the hearts of the world scholars. If Northern Qi did not intend to sue for peace, they would not have spent so much to invite Zhuang Mohan to the capital with the diplomatic mission." The officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies all came from the imperial examinations, so of course they knew of Zhuang Mohan's name. After a moment's thought, they realized that this was indeed the case. But this alone was not enough to bring the negotiations back to the original path. Xian Chiwu frowned. If we could find out why Zhuang Mohan was willing to come, perhaps it would be of some help. The Overwatch Council's files clearly stated that Zhuang Mohan was willing to come because, first, the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi had lowered themselves to beg him. Second, Zhuang Mohan had always prided himself as a mortal saint and wanted to mediate the military conflict between the two countries. The third reason seemed to be his personal reasons, which had not yet been discovered. Although Fan Xian despised the attitude of this saint, he would not belittle his reputation. But at this moment, he would not reveal these reasons in front of all the officials. He only replied quietly, "If we could meet him, perhaps we would be able to find some clues." Registrar Xiao shook his head and said somewhat helplessly, "According to the customs of the two countries, such a person is usually only seen at banquets in front of the palace. If an official of the Chamberlain of Dependencies asks for an audience, and he refuses, there is nothing we can do. We would only be humiliating ourselves." Suddenly, his eyes brightened. But Deputy Fan's reputation for poetry has long been known throughout the world. I believe that Zhuang Mohan would not refuse the title of meeting friends through poetry. Fan Xian was surprised. He had only copied 3 poems, and 2 of them had been written by Ruo. How could he make his reputation known throughout the world? Fortunately, Xian Chiwu shook his head and helped him out. Zhuang Mohan has always been an extremely arrogant person. His scholarly works, poetry, and songs are all the top talents of the world.
There is no way he would lower himself to meet Deputy Fan. In my opinion, the key to Northern Qi's invitation this time is the banquet in front of the palace. They want to use his reputation to persuade His Majesty. The officials thought that this was probably the case. After the meeting was over, Fan Xian found an opportunity to pull Xi and Shuwu aside and hand over the proposal that he and Ruo had spent several nights organizing. Xi and Shuwu flipped through it hastily, and his eyes brightened. He had not expected Fan Xian to write something like this. Although the evidence was rather absurd, after careful analysis, it seemed to point directly at the current situation in Northern Qi. Good, Xi and Shuwu said excitedly. With this, the office of the Grand Herald will have more confidence in our negotiations. But, Deputy Fan, why did you not mention it before, and now you are giving it to me in private? Fan Xian looked at his superior's suspicious expression and smiled. Some of the deductions are a bit absurd. These are my personal opinions, so I did not dare say them in public. I'm only giving them to you in private for your consideration. Xi and Shuwu could not contain his excitement. He stood in the corridor and read carefully, but his brow gradually furrowed. After a long time, he said quietly, Master Fan, there are many things in here that even the court does not know about. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that he could not hide it from Xi and Shuwu, but he had trained his composure for over 10 years, ever since he arrived in the capital. His expression did not change. He smiled. There are some things that I cannot say. One of the most important things about being an official was to pretend to be mysterious. As expected, Xi and Shuwu did not pursue the matter. Instead, he smiled warmly. If this negotiation is successful, I will certainly write to His Majesty and guarantee you a great service. Fan Xian smiled, bowed, and excused himself. Xi and Shuwu watched Fan Xian's green-robed silhouette disappear into the courtyard, and a look of confusion appeared on his face. He was close to the Crown Prince, and naturally knew that Count Sinan held a private power that belonged to His Majesty. But this power had never been displayed on the political stage of the Kingdom of Qing. Could it be that Fan Xian dared to use it just because of Fan Xian? He had never connected Fan Xian to the Overwatch Council. After all, the Overwatch Council was His Majesty's private spy agency. Even the princes could not interfere, much less the illegitimate son of an official. Sitting in the sedan chair, Xi and Shuwu rested his chin on his hand and pondered. After the sedan chair stopped, he looked at the tall red palace wall outside. It seemed that his advice to the Crown Prince had been correct. As for the Fan family, they could only be roped in, not attacked. Chapter 126. Within the Eastern Palace, there were two factions of opinion. The faction that opposed Xi and Shuwu believed that since the Fan family of Count Sinan had a good relationship with King Jing and now had a marriage alliance with the Prime Minister, Crown Prince Jing was a close friend of the Second Prince, and the Prime Minister was gradually distancing himself in the Eastern Palace. The Fan family must be on the Second Prince's side. Xi and Shuwu firmly opposed this view, because in his view, Fan Jian was not an ordinary official who would follow the Prime Minister's lead. In the depths of the palace, Xi and Shuwu obediently knelt in the doorway of the study, his buttocks raised high. Fortunately, his official robes covered it, so it did not look ugly. Rise! The Emperor's voice came from behind the curtains. Xi and Shuwu stood up, his arms hanging by his side, not daring to move. He had been to the study a few times, but he still could not get used to the natural pressure. 2 soybean-sized beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. He did not know if it was because of the summer heat or because he was nervous, but he did not dare to wipe them away. The sound of paper flipping rang out from behind the curtains. After a long silence, the Emperor lightly said, "This statement is reasonable and well-founded." Very good. Since that mother in the north is still not willing to settle down, then that's good. You have helped me open my mouth wider. Xi and Shuwu replied loudly, "Yes, Your Majesty." The Emperor's voice suddenly became strange. "Assistant Minister Fan's son is now your deputy?" Xi and Shuwu did not expect His Majesty to be so concerned about Fan Jian. A few more beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, and he respectfully replied, "Yes." The emperor seemed to be very interested in this matter. "Oh, this Fan Xian, I made him a functionary in Taichung Temple. Why did you want to transfer him to Honglu Temple?" Although His Majesty's voice was still gentle, Xian Chiwu was so nervous that he almost fainted. He did not dare to hide anything, and answered honestly, "A few days ago, Your Majesty ordered me to lecture in the Eastern Palace, and I spoke with the Crown Prince about the Northern Qi envoy. Because Fan Xian is related to this matter, and because he is famous in the capital, the Northern Qi envoy has Zhuang Mohan, and the court needs a scholar to receive him. So I ventured to suggest this, and Your Majesty agreed." Yes. Behind the curtain, the emperor admired this official's frank attitude. He had never been afraid of people forming cliques in the court, but this clique had to be formed in the open. "If there is no mistake in this matter, I will give you full authority to handle this matter. Even if it is the Crown Prince, you do not need to ask." Yes. Xian Chiwu had never thought of hiding his relationship with the Crown Prince from His Majesty. After all, he was the person appointed by His Majesty to serve in the Eastern Palace. The emperor flipped through the file again, faintly frowning. How did Fan Xian do? Xian Chiwu did not dare to be greedy and replied honestly, "The dossier that Your Majesty is looking at is the result of Deputy Fan's analysis." Analysis? For some reason, the emperor's tone became a little angry. This is getting more and more ridiculous. Xian Chiwu did not know why His Majesty was angry and was terrified. Fortunately, this matter did not seem to have much to do with the negotiation. After he left the study, His Majesty lifted the curtain and walked out. On his face, there was a trace of anger, but also a trace of helplessness. He ordered the eunuch beside him, "Summon Qin Pingping to the palace." The eunuch accepted the order and left. The master of the kingdom of Qing, the most powerful man in the world, walked out of his study and stood in the hallway of the palace. He looked at the dim moon, and the corners of his lips curled up. He said to himself, "The most powerful weapon of the nation, and instead of directly assisting the office of the Grand Herald, you use it as a stepping stone for a child's advancement. Well done, Qin Pingping. It looks like if I don't teach you a lesson, you really will give my courtyard to that child to play with." What kind of person was the emperor? From a file that claimed to be the result of Fan Xian's analysis, he could immediately see the shadow of the Overwatch Council. But looking at his expression, he did not seem to be angry, only a little amused. Xian Chiwu's attempt to have the Crown Prince win over the Fan family was actually in line with the emperor's thoughts. The Eastern Palace had finally shown some political wisdom, and the Crown Prince seemed to have improved. This fact made the emperor feel slightly gratified. In the Eastern Palace, a fierce quarrel had broken out. The two sides of the quarrel were Xian Chiwu from the office of the Grand Herald and Guo Baoquan, the of the palace. The content of the quarrel was naturally related to the 8th level official called Fan Xian. Looking at the red faces of both sides, it was obvious how intense the quarrel had been. Xian Chiwu looked at Guo Baoquan with a hint of disdain. "As an official, I have to be frank. I have come to assist the Crown Prince on His Majesty's orders, in order to help the Crown Prince plan for 1,000 years, and to choose a good talent. Functionary Fan Xian has a reputation for talent in the capital. Looking at his recent actions, he knows when to advance and when to retreat. He has real talent, and the Fan family has always been a loyal subject of the royal family. Of course, the Crown Prince should condescend to accept such an official, and not turn him away just because of a moment's anger." Guo Baoquan sneered. "Does Lord Shaoqing think that I only remember that punch? Don't forget the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's Manor, and that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law." "Don't you know the Prime Minister's direction?" Xian Chiwu straightened his neck and said, "I don't know. I only know that the Kingdom of Qing only has one emperor, and the Kingdom of Qing only has one Crown Prince. Any attempt to divide the kingdom into factions is extremely foolish." He was not a man with only great ambitions, but no skills. Of course, he knew that the second prince had recently become popular. But in terms of strategy, he still believed that the Eastern Palace did not need to treat the second prince as an opponent. Once that happened, it would open a dangerous door. As long as the crown prince remained upright and righteous, there would be no enemies to speak of. The crown prince, who was sitting high above, sighed. He was indeed lecherous and cowardly, but he was not an idiot. In the depths of his heart, he knew that if he looked at the bigger picture, Xi and Shaoqing's view was undoubtedly correct. But politics had always been a battle to the death. Even if he was careful, who could guarantee that his two brothers, who were eyeing the throne, would not do something? The situation at hand has not reached that point. The crown prince rubbed his temples and said with some annoyance, "After all, I am the heir to the throne. It is my duty to reserve talents for the court. As for my brother, don't talk nonsense. That would be too absurd." This was the helplessness of the royal palace. It was clear that they were on guard against each other, but no one could say anything verbally. What about Fan Xian? Guobaoquan still did not want to give up. Xi and Shuwu snorted and said, "Master Gua, I think you have been misjudging one thing." "What is it?" the crown prince asked curiously. "Many officials, including you, have put the Fan family under the second prince's faction because of the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's manor. But who can prove this? This edict from the Eastern Palace has given Fan Xian a chance to shine. If the Fan family is really as Master Wu says, I'm afraid they would not dare accept this mission." Xi and Shuwu continued coldly. "The most important thing is that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Master Gu's judgment that Fan Xian will not be loyal to the Crown Prince is absurd." "What's absurd about it?" Guobaoquan's eyes flashed with viciousness. "Whether it's in court or in secret, it all shows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess and is trying to break away from the palace's influence. As the Prime Minister of a country, he should not be controlled by the people in the palace." Xi and Shuwu came to his senses and bowed to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince shook his head indifferently and signaled for him to continue. Xi and Shuwu continued. "What Master Wu said earlier is where the problem lies. Everyone knows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess, but what does this have to do with the Eastern Palace? Does this mean that the Prime Minister is no longer loyal to His Majesty? Is he no longer on His Highness's side?" The Crown Prince frowned. "But Mayan has been very angry with the Prime Minister lately. Your Highness, forgive me for being presumptuous, but you cannot change your attitude towards the Prime Minister because of the eldest princess's attitude." Xi and Shuwu was neither servile nor overbearing. The Crown Prince's frown deepened. But he wanted to say something, but stopped. Guobaoquan took this opportunity to speak coldly. "But if the Prime Minister is still the same as before, why hasn't he come to the Eastern Palace to pay his respects after the recent court meetings?" Xi and Shuwu smiled confidently and replied, "I did not deny that. Your Highness, this is only an arrangement. It is far from a competition of strength between the two sides. Truly intelligent officials will naturally stick closely to His Majesty. This is enough to ensure the longevity of their families. The Prime Minister is the same. He may be wavering between the Crown Prince and the Second Prince, but in the end, he will still listen to His Majesty's orders. If we want the Prime Minister to truly stand on our side." He took a deep breath. "The key lies in Fan Xian. The Prime Minister no longer has a true son. Fan Xian is the future of the Lin family. If we can get Fan Xian to pledge allegiance to your Highness, the Prime Minister's attitude will naturally change." Guobaoquan snorted. "Don't forget the relationship between Crown Prince Jing and Fan Xian. And don't forget who worked for the person we found out a few days ago," Xi and Shuwu said coldly. "That person deliberately let Fan Xian and your Highness run into each other. Naturally, he hoped that your Highness would remember the grudge from a few days ago and humiliate Fan Xian, so that Fan Xian would truly join his side. Fortunately, your Highness is wise. Naturally, you will not fall for such a despicable person's trick." The Crown Prince smiled warmly, somewhat pleased. If the Fan family is really on his side, why would he need to use such a trick? Xi and Shuwu continued. "I believe that with the Fan family's power, they will certainly find out the truth behind this matter. If they do find out that person did it, I fear that Fan Xian will bear a grudge. so we do not need to worry about the Fan family's current attitude. The Crown Prince was somewhat moved. He said softly, "If the Fan family is still in the dark and has fallen for that person's trick, I might as well tell them. Taking in Fan Xian is the same as taking in the Fan family and the Lin family. The two great powers in the capital, the civil officials and the nobles, at least half of the people look to these two families. And in a few years, I'm afraid that even the palace treasury will be managed by this young man." Xian Chu said softly to the Crown Prince, "An 8th-rank official can bring more than a few poems to the people of the capital." Chapter 127. The Crown Prince was moved. After a while, he finally made up his mind. He slapped the desk and said, "Very well, I will give Fan Xian a chance. I hope he will not disappoint me." The Eastern Palace's plan was set. Guobaoquan was sad, Xian Chu was excited, and the Crown Prince felt that he was wise and tolerant. But none of them knew that the Empress and eldest princess had once tried to assassinate Fan Xian. The true power behind the Eastern Palace had already clashed with Fan Xian twice, once in Danzhou, and once in Yolan Street and at the foot of Song Mountain. Of course, they had no way of knowing that a few years later, things would become so absurd and inconceivable. The night in the royal palace was always more distant and dark than in other places. It hid all the truth in the past and made it impossible to see what kind of face would appear in the near future. With the Overwatch Council's intelligence as their backing, the negotiations over the next few days suddenly changed. Northern Qi still wanted to use the sticky candy tactic to drag things out day by day, hoping to wear down the patience of the Qin court. Who would have thought that the powerful vice minister of the Honglu Temple, Xian Chu, will become even more ferocious over the past 2 days at the negotiation table? His aura had transformed into a mountain-splitting axe, chopping down on the other party again and again. After 3 rounds of negotiations, issues such as the exchange of prisoners, tribute, and titles were all resolved. All that was left was the difficult bone to chew, the redrawing of the borders between the vassal states. As the assistant envoy, Fan Xian watched the entire process with cold eyes. He greatly admired Xian Shaoqing's knowledge and charisma. He had not expected the Crown Prince to be surrounded by more than just ordinary people. Not everyone in the Eastern Palace was as annoying as Guobaoquan. Xian Chu, in his free time during the negotiations, also had time to communicate with Fan Xian or observe him in secret. He was surprised that Fan Xian, so young, was able to maintain his composure. He increasingly felt that he could not see through this young nobleman. Overall, the negotiations went smoothly. Aside from the Overwatch Council's help in compiling the dossier, Fan Xian did not do much. But in the future, when it came to rewards, he would always be missing a share, so Fan Xian was very satisfied with his current life. The bookstore was managed by Qingyu Hall's 7th-Yi shopkeeper, and Fan Xizha often worked as an accountant, so there was no need for him to worry about it. Naturally, the women of the Lin and Fan manors were busy preparing for the wedding in 2 months. Even Lady Lu was very happy with the fact that Fan Xian was going to be the fake son-in-law. She played the role of a stepmother and was very busy. After all, if he married the emperor's adopted daughter, Fan Xian would probably not inherit the title of nobility. Furthermore, Lin Wanner had another identity. The old spinsters in the palace often came to the manor to make irresponsible remarks. Every few days, there would be an edict from one of the concubines, causing Count Sinan and Fan Jian to be badly battered. For Fan Xian, who had no understanding of the etiquette of the palace, these things were naturally avoided as much as possible. It was just that Lin Wanner and Ruo, who were helping their brother carry the ceremony, had to spend every day immersed in this pain. The second prince had asked Crown Prince Jing to speak on his behalf twice, wanting to invite Fan Xian for a meeting. But the encounter with the Crown Prince during the summer vacation had left a shadow in Fan Xian's heart, so he pushed it back to the end of the month, hoping that things would have calmed down by then. After all, it seemed that the Eastern Palace's attitude toward Fan Manor had changed. It wasn't that he dared to refuse the prince's invitation, but that he had used a good name. When he was working for the country, he dared not linger in Flower Alley. During these days, the only thing that worried him was Zhuang Mohan of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission, who had been living in seclusion, and Sigu Jian's first disciple of the Dongyi diplomatic mission. Of these two, one was a scholar and the other a warrior. Both were top figures in the world. It was a bit too quiet in the capital. Zhuang Mohan had been invited by the Empress Dowager to stay in the palace to give lectures, while Sigu Jian's head disciple, Yun Jilan, had remained with the diplomatic mission. Fan Xian paid the most attention to Yun Jilan. After all, Zhuang Mohan's reputation as a scholar did not conflict with Fan Xian's, while Yun Jilan had taken his life. But in the capital of the kingdom of Qing, Fan Xian believed that Yun Jilan would not be so stupid as to seek vengeance on him alone. So what really bothered Fan Xian was a key. At night, he stared at the black leather case in a daze. The lock looked to be made of brass, but he had tried it before. Even the slender dagger that Fei Jia had left behind could not make a mark on it. It seemed that the material was strange. Behind the brass keyhole, there seemed to be some sort of mechanism, but if he could not obtain the key, he would not even be able to see what the mechanism looked like. Fan Xian had once tried to find some way to get to know Eunuch Hong of the palace, but after a few attempts, he realized something. Although he seemed to be doing very well in the capital, there was still a long way to go before he reached the top of the world. The crown prince and the second prince wanted to rope him in because of the Fan and Lin manners behind him. It was not because of anything special about him. In the area around the palace, because he did not need to look at the officials, he had no way of getting in touch with them. It was also not convenient for Wanner to enter the palace often, so there was no one who could help him. Even if he wanted to get to know Hong Xixiang, it would be difficult, not to mention that he had to do, as Uncle Wu Zhu said, and keep him outside the palace for 2 hours. When the second prince used Crown Prince Li Hongsheng to invite Fan Xian, he had cleverly used the mouths of others to see if he could get to know Eunuch Hong. But Li Hongsheng shook his head. That old dog would only lie in the shade of the Empress Dowager's palace, and would never leave the palace. It looks like I have to change my plan. With a thud, Fan Xian kicked the case back onto the bed. Looking at Wu Zhu, who seemed to be asleep in the corner, he said, "I have no way of dragging Eunuch Hong out." Wu Zhu slowly raised his head. "I can lure him out, or you could try to find a key in the palace." Fan Xian was shocked. With his average ability of between the 4th level and the 6th level, did he want to die in the palace? But he narrowed his eyes and felt that this seemed to be a more feasible path. Uncle Wu Zhu always said that his power was only at the 3rd level, but he was able to kill Cheng Jushu. It seemed that Wu Zhu's calculation ability was too strong, and so he underestimated his ability to use Jinqi. Of course, this was not something Fan Xian could say. If it really is too dangerous, why do I need this key? This was a question that had been lingering in Fan Xian's mind for a long time. If it's just out of curiosity, it doesn't seem worth it to take such a big risk. Don't you want to know what the lady left for you? I do. Fan Xian sat on the bed, his head slightly lowered. But I think that mother must want me to be happy, safe, and live happily in this world. If she put her son in danger because she wanted to know what she left for him, perhaps mother would not want it. Wu Zhu also lowered his head, the black cloth covering his eyes blending into the darkness around him. Although he was not looking at Fan Xian still felt a chill. "You're very satisfied with your current life." Wu Zhu's voice was very cold. As always, he rarely asked questions. He was just calmly stating a fact. Fan Xian was startled. After he entered the capital, especially in the period after summer, he seemed to really enjoy the power, wealth, and stability that came with being the son of a noble family. But you cannot control your own life. Wu Zhu continued, speaking coldly. Everything before you is constructed according to the plans of Chun Pingping and Fan Jian. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He understood what Wu Zhu meant. But even though he had lived 2 lives and thought he had seen the coldness and treachery of the world, he still did not dare believe this kind of judgment. He lowered his voice and said, "Can you not even trust them?" Wu Zhu's voice became even colder. "It is my habit to trust no one. That kind of life will be very difficult." Fan Xian closed his eyes, as if he was simulating an eternal life in the dark. After they die, what will you do? Wu Zhu rarely asked a question, and this one hit Fan Xian where it hurt. Fan Xian frowned and said, I understand. Wu Zhu ignored his expression and continued speaking without a trace of emotion. The only thing that can protect you is not conspiracy, not power, not anything else. It is only power. You must remember this. Fan Xian stood up from the side of the bed and bowed respectfully toward this servant, this teacher, this elder brother. I do not know what the lady left you in the box, but I do know that you must have enough power to protect yourself and intimidate your enemies. Determination is also a kind of power, so I want you to find that key. Yes, I will take care of it immediately. When Fan Xian raised his head, he found that Wu Zhu had once again disappeared into the night. In the 10 years they had spent together, Wu Zhu rarely spoke so much in one go, other than on rainy nights when he thought of his mother. Fan Xian understood what Wu Zhu meant. The prosperity of the capital was bone-crushing and soul-consuming. It had indeed caused the calmness and strength that he had honed since he was young to show signs of weakness. This was a warning to him not to rely too much on the so-called power of his family and the legacy of his mother. These days, although he had worked hard to cultivate the tyrannical Jinqi in his body and to familiarize himself with the 3 poisonous needles, it was as Wu Zhu had said, his heart was not as strong as it had been in Danzhou. The only thing that can protect each and every one of us is our own strength. A child without a mother is like a blade of grass. Even the grass has to run out of the cracks in the rock. Ignore the sun and the rain. Take root deeper and make your stem sturdier. That is the right path. Chapter 128. The sky in the east had already turned red. The sun slowly rose from the sleepy clouds and shone on the capital's grandest buildings. The outer walls of the palace were even redder than the sky. They calmly and terrifyingly watched the crowd in the square in front of them. Fan Xian was also one of these people. He looked at the tall palace walls and the bottomless doorway at the bottom of the wall. He felt that this dark place was very much like the mouth of a monster. He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of nervousness. Fan Xian, like everyone else in the world, still felt a sense of awe when faced with this solemn symbol of imperial power. But awe didn't mean obedience, and it didn't mean no resistance. This was where he was different from everyone else. After the guards at the palace gate examined them, they nodded with a trace of arrogance. Fan Xian and his group obediently walked in. Today was the day of the festival, and the palace had issued an edict to summon an 8th-level functionary into the palace. The edict had arrived yesterday, and Fan Manor had been busy all night before deciding on the number of people to enter the palace. Naturally, Fan Jian wouldn't go. There were few women in Count Sinan's manor, so a few distant relatives of the Fan clan in the capital had come forward to volunteer. Fan Xian had never seen such excitement before, and Fan Jian coldly put an end to everyone's thoughts. In the end, it was decided that Lady Lu and Fan Ro would accompany Fan Xian into the palace, along with 2 old nannies. These 2 old nannies had been around his grandmother's time in Danzhou, and were very familiar with the rules of the palace. Lady Lu's willingness to follow Fan Xian into the palace was somewhat unexpected to Fan Xian. He knew that although Lady Lu had never been promoted, she had in fact been in contact with some of the nobles in the palace since she was a child. Their relationship was not ordinary. With her by his side, Fan Xian's trip to the palace would probably be much smoother. The sound of light and hurried footsteps echoed in the quiet doorway. The doorway was so deep that the rising sun could only illuminate half of it. The other half was particularly dark. A cold wind suddenly blew out from the palace walls, making it difficult for everyone to keep their eyes open. The weather of August and September suddenly had a hint of the chilly late autumn. Fan Xian subtly touched his belt and felt the pills that were smaller than soybeans. He felt a little more at ease. He knew that the checks for entering the palace were particularly strict, so before he left the manor, he hid his secret crossbow and dagger in his room. However, Uncle Wu Zhu's lecture had left a deep impression on him. Even though he was in the royal palace, the safest place in the world, he still prepared a few life-saving tricks. Ta-ta-ta-ta. Man is a very strange animal, and people are a very strange group. Walking under the quiet palace walls, the footsteps of the group of 6 people gradually became synchronized. They landed on the ground at the same time and raised their feet at the same time. Following the little eunuch in the lead, they sounded the same monotonous syllable as if they were playing a 4-string zither at the same time. A wave of discomfort welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He forced himself to pause and let his footsteps stagger with the others. The synchronized footsteps under the palace walls were immediately broken. He gently pulled his sister's sleeve and said in a low voice, "I'm a little nervous." Fan Ruoruo smiled and wanted to give him some encouragement. But the little eunuch in front of them turned his head and looked at Fan Xian with a frown. He seemed a little dissatisfied. Lady Lu frowned and said quietly, "The palace is not like other places. Be careful what you say." The little eunuch wasn't handsome, and he had a worried look on his face. Hearing Countess Sinan's words, he suddenly felt that he had gained some glory. Where is this? This was the royal palace. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He hadn't expected Lady Lu to continue with a smile. But there's no need to be nervous. I've been in this palace since I was a child. At that time, Eunuch Hong was the leader of the eunuchs. In the blink of an eye, it's little children who serve in the palace. Hearing this, the little eunuch in front of him didn't dare put on airs. He hurriedly walked into the palace. He had thought he was bringing some country bumpkins into the palace, but it turned out to be acquaintances visiting relatives. The royal palace was enormous. After the long entrance to the city, there was a large square made of blue stone, which made one feel suddenly enlightened. The early morning sun shone on the roof of the Taiji Palace's main hall, and the yellow glazed tiles reflected a dazzling luster. There was a large column several meters away from the hall, and the long stone steps in front of the hall looked like a white jade road leading to the Milky Way. Fan Xian squinted at the building in front of him, and a sense of absurdity welled up in his heart. He wondered if he had arrived at the Palace Museum. Perhaps this sense of absurdity diluted his nervousness and his sense of estrangement from the unfamiliar palace. For the rest of the journey, Fan Xian finally returned to his natural demeanor. He looked a little like he had when he first entered Fan Manor. His face was full of smiles, and he looked around at the palace maids and eunuchs with their heads bowed as they walked along the palace walls. Occasionally, he raised his head to look at the eaves in the distance, but he didn't know which palace it was, and he didn't know who lived there. The young eunuch shook his head, but a faintly discernible smile floated on Lady Lu's lips. She thought to herself, this eldest young master really has a personality that fears neither the heavens nor the earth. The purpose of entering the palace today was simple. The concubines in the palace wanted to see what the talented Fan Xian, who was about to marry Chener, looked like. Although the purpose was simple, the process was particularly complicated. So everyone in Fan Manor got up early, washed up, and dressed up. They rushed into the palace as soon as the palace doors opened, and then waited in a corner room, waiting for one of the concubines to summon them. Those who were summoned could wait, but the concubines in the palace were not willing to wait. Because he had gotten up so early, Fan Xian sat in the corner room, drinking the palace's fine tea. He was still sleepy, and his spirit was not good. Lady Lu glanced at him and stood up with a smile. She said to the eunuch who had come to greet them in the palace, "Eunuch Ho, long time no see." As she said this, she extended her finger and handed over the banknotes without the slightest hint of anger. Fan Xian peeked, and the corners of his lips curled up. He almost laughed. His aunt's methods had indeed been influenced by his father, and she relied on banknotes to beat people. Unexpectedly, Eunuch Ho looked embarrassed and respectfully said, "Lady Fan, aren't you slapping me in the face? You grew up with the masters in the palace, and I wouldn't dare beg for food here." Hearing this, Lady Lu couldn't help but laugh. "This is a reward for you, not a purchase. Who are you afraid of?" Eunuch Ho chuckled, and the wrinkles on his face squeezed together. He said quietly, "They know you're entering the palace today, and there's no reason for them to keep you waiting for too long. Don't worry, it's just that it's too early, and I'm afraid they're all busy washing up. I'll just sit for a bit." Fan Xian's ears twitched, and he realized that the old eunuch was referring to Lady Lu as Lady Fan. It seemed that the palace was already leaning towards Lady Lu's promotion. He also heard that the various palaces were still cleaning the courtyards in the morning. He had originally felt that he had woken up too early and had come too early. Hearing this, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Fortunately, Eunuch Ho was right. Count Sinan was wise to have Lady Lu accompany him to the palace. Before the morning court had even begun, the 3 members of the Fan family had already entered the rear palace. The 2 old nannies were received outside, and there was good tea and water. They were old people who had been in the palace for a long time, and they didn't mind the boredom. The first to go was to Yi Guipin. She was the mother of the 3rd prince, and because she was a mother who relied on her son's status, she was promoted from a talented person to a Guipin. Fan Xian bowed respectfully and then heard a gentle voice. "Rise." Yi Guipin was born plain and clean, but that was all. She was not at all as beautiful as Fan Xian had imagined. Much to Fan Xian's surprise, Lady Lu looked at Yi Guipin with moist eyes. After the 2 women bowed, they held hands and looked at each other, speechless. Fan Xian looked at his sister with a puzzled expression. Roro's face was calm, and she was not at all surprised. After listening to them talk for a while, Fan Xian realized that Yi Guipin was actually Lady Lu's cousin. Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. Only now did he realize that the Lu family had such deep roots. Fortunately, he had carried out a policy of appeasement after entering the capital, and Lady Lu had treated him kindly. Otherwise, if the 2 of them had really clashed, who knew who would have died? "Why haven't you come to the palace to see me?" Yi Guipin wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes. "It's been 4 years, and you have the heart to leave me alone in the palace. It wasn't easy to get an edict to summon you to the palace to talk with me. Who knew you wouldn't come? You've really depressed me to death." A trace of sadness flashed across Lady Lu's face. She didn't speak for a while. After a while, she said quietly, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." She didn't look at Fan Xian, but Fan Xian looked at Lady Lu's slightly thin shoulders. A strange light flashed in his eyes. Hearing Yi Guipin speak of 4 years, he very sensitively thought of the assassination attempt in Danzhou. According to his father, Lady Lu was only a scapegoat for the assassination attempt. The real masterminds behind the scenes were the 2 most noble women in the palace. Was that the reason Lady Lu hadn't entered the palace for 4 years? "In the future, I will often come to the palace to see you." Lady Lu smiled warmly and took Yi Guipin's hand. "Didn't I come today?" Yi Guipin's anger turned into a smile. "If it weren't for the fact that the young master of the Fan family is going to marry the most precious girl in the palace, I wouldn't have hoped to see you." She turned to Fan Xian and asked gently, "You are Fan Xian?" Fan Xian hurriedly stood up. His elegant face was filled with the warmest of smiles. He bowed to the ground. "Nephew Fan Xian greets Aunt Lu." This was against the rules. The palace maids and eunuchs were stunned. Lady Lu was also a little surprised. She thought to herself, "I'm not your real mother." But Fan Xian shamelessly claimed a relationship. Clearly, Yi Guipin, who was tired of the rules of the palace, liked it. She looked at Fan Xian and beamed. "You really are a good child." Chapter 129. There were many ridiculous things in this world, but to be judged as a good child after saying only 8 words, even Fan Xian, who was almost 17 years old, felt that this matter was ridiculous to the extreme. This palace was indeed different from other places. The judgments of the high and mighty nobles seemed to be too arbitrary and dependent on their own preferences. Although Fan Xian did not know the relationship between Lady Lu and Yi Guipin, it did not prevent him from learning from Wanner that Yi Guipin was a highly favored concubine. Otherwise, she would not have been able to give birth to an 8-year-old prince, despite the emperor's reputation of cultivating his moral character and keeping away from women. As they chatted in the palace, Yi Guipin seemed to really like Fan Xian. The expression on her face grew happier and happier. Fan Xian was tactful and picked out a few jokes he remembered from his previous life to listen to them. Suddenly, there was a burst of bell-like laughter in the palace hall. Fan Xian found that Lady Guiping's temperament was straightforward and ruthless. He did not know how she was able to maintain such a temperament in this shameful palace. He could not help but be surprised and admire her. After chatting for a while, the sun had already gradually risen. Lady Lu smiled and asked, "Where's the third prince?" Guiping sighed and said, "That child is still very afraid of strangers. As soon as he wakes up, he shrinks himself in the back of the palace and doesn't want to come out. I'm afraid he won't show his face until it's time to eat." Lady Lu laughed and said, "It turns out that our third prince is quite shy." Although there was a difference between master and subject, Lady Lu and Guiping were still sisters, so their words were not as particular. Guiping stretched out her slender index finger. Her nails were painted red and looked very attractive. She pointed at Fan Xian and said, "Isn't this one of yours also shy?" At that moment, a shy smile appeared on Fan Xian's face, just in response to Guiping's words. "Well, sister, you and Ruo can stay here and chat with me." Guiping seemed to know that Lady Lu did not want to go to the Empress and the eldest princess, so she made the decision to keep them as guests. "I will let Xing'er take Fan Xian to those palaces." Madame Lu's expression darkened slightly. She bowed and said, "How can this be done? Today I received the imperial edict to enter the palace and be the first to see Guiping Nyang. I was originally worried that I would offend those Nyang. If I enter the palace and don't visit those Nyang, I'm afraid it would be somewhat disrespectful." Hearing these words, Guiping snorted and said, "Sister, I think it's best if you don't go. Originally, it was just to summon Fan Xian into the palace. You should keep me company and talk. I want to see who in the palace dares to make irresponsible remarks." Guiping was a cheerful, noble woman with a trace of naivety, but when she lost her temper, she still appeared very dignified. The entire palace quieted down. Fan Xian coughed lightly and said, "Auntie, second madam, I will go by myself. You and my sister can keep Aunt Lu company and talk for a while." Hearing him say this, Madame Lu had no choice but to agree. She and the serving girl called Xing escorted Fan Xian outside the palace. In a quiet voice, she warned him of a few things to take note of, and without anyone noticing, she moved to Fan Xian's shoulder. In a voice as quiet as a mosquito, she said, "Everyone in the palace has been informed. There will be people in each palace to receive you. Don't be too nervous." Fan Xian's heart trembled, and he complied. Turning around, he saw that his sister had followed him out, looking at him encouragingly. For some reason, his heart was filled with warmth. He smiled and thought, when a mother-in-law looks at a son-in-law, the more she looks at him, the more she likes him. Furthermore, I was born with such a beautiful body. Dealing with a few resentful women in the palace should be a piece of cake. After the candidate for the emperor's son-in-law had left Guiping's palace, Madame Lu said a few words to Fan Ruo, and then entered the inner chambers with Guiping. Guiping quietly looked in her eyes and said, "For years ago, I advised you not to listen to the advice of those two palaces. Now, Fan Xian is still alive and well, but you have chilled Sir Fan's heart. Sister, you have been intelligent your whole life. How could you have made such a mistake?" Madame Lu stood where she was, speechless for a long time. Her eyes gradually became resentful, and she quietly said, "You also know that as mothers, don't we think for our children? The third prince is still young, so you can stay out of it. In a few years, I'm afraid you will understand why I made such a big mistake." Xing was a young girl of about 13 or 14 years of age. As they walked through the palace, Fan Xian noticed that the girl's head was always lowered. He couldn't help but tease her. "Can't you see where you're going?" Xing'er giggled, revealing her small teeth. "Master Fan, it's best not to talk too much in the palace." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He knew that there were many rules in the palace, but he didn't think that even a young girl would be so cautious and self-restrained. Fan Xian followed behind Xing, looking at the clothes she wore. His eyes swept over the girl's undeveloped waist, and then immediately turned to the buildings of the palace. There was a smile on his face, but his brain was working quickly, trying to memorize the complicated scenery of the road in his mind, in preparation for that matter in the future. As they walked, they passed by flowers and trees, and stepped on stones and grass. Although the palace was large, there was a time when they would arrive. Although there were many palaces, not all of them were so grand that they could shake one's heart. Looking at the quiet courtyard in front of him, Fan Xian took a deep breath and followed Xing inside. This was the residence of the second prince's birth mother, Imperial Concubine Shu. This imperial concubine seemed to love peace and quiet. The courtyard was also decorated very simply and elegantly. Apart from a few pink flowering trees, there were no other decorations. A bamboo curtain covered everything inside, but it could not hide the fragrance of books seeping out from the curtains. "Greetings, Concubine Shu. Master Fan, please sit." Without exchanging pleasantries, Fan Xian and Concubine Shu sat apart from the curtain. Without any warning, Concubine Shu suddenly asked in a clear voice, 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn, always a guest. "Master Fan, when you were young, you were often in Danzhou. Do you think the capital is only a place for guests?" Fan Xian was a bit surprised, but he answered with a straight face. Using this as a starting point, he and Concubine Shu sat down and discussed the Tao. They talked about all the classics and poems in the world, until their mouths were a bit dry. Only then did they tacitly stop talking. Fan Xian felt some lingering fear. He really didn't think that the second prince's mother was a talented woman of the palace. She was so knowledgeable that he almost couldn't deal with her. He couldn't help but think, what kind of person would a prince be raised by such a woman? "Don't be nervous." Concubine Shu's temperament was very gentle. Through the bamboo curtain, he could faintly see that there was only a wooden fork on her head. She was so plain that she was out of place in the palace. Grew up in the palace. Before His Majesty took her as his adopted daughter, we had nothing to do, so we raised her like a daughter. There is no one in the palace who doesn't like her. So if Master Fan wants to marry the most precious pearl of the palace, we can't help but watch. Fan Xian's back was covered in a cold sweat. Although he usually had some understanding, it was only today that he truly felt his fiancée's position in the palace. Concubine Shu was gentle and light. She seemed to be quite satisfied with Fan Xian's way of talking. After a while, she let Fan Xian leave. But before they parted, she said quietly, "I like to read, and His Majesty has collected some rare books for me. I have already let the palace servants select some of the precious ones and make copies. Master Fan, if you want to go to the other concubines, I will have them sent to Yiguipin." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that this was a generous gift. He knew that this concubine was giving it on behalf of the second prince. He didn't dare to say anything more. He calmly bowed and left. After leaving Concubine Shu's courtyard, Fan Xian wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The palace maid leading the way, Xing was a little familiar with him. She walked on her tiptoes, hopping and skipping. She looked back at his expression and asked curiously, "It's not hot today." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He had thought that entering the palace today was just a courtesy visit. He didn't know that it was even more tense than the palace examination. Presumably, the concubines in the palace were very curious about Lin Wan marrying him, so they wanted to see Fan Xian's literary and martial talents. Next, the two of them went to the great prince's birth mother, Ning the Talented. Fan Xian knew that although this woman's position was not high, and she was only a talented person, he knew from her that it was because she was from Dongyi. So Fan Xian purposely treated her with respect. Ning the Talented was nearly 40 years old, but she still retained her charm. Her expression was very gentle, like that of a Dongyi woman. These years, the great prince had been in Chushu, and she had no one. It was inevitable that she would be lonely. Fortunately, when Lin Wan was in the palace, she often came here to play, so her feelings for Wan were not the same as those of the other concubines. She looked at Fan Xian coldly. Her phoenix eyes were cold. "You are Fan Xian." Fan Xian knew that this noble lady had once saved the emperor on the battlefield, and had raised a prince who was good at war. She was certainly a very dignified person, so he wasn't surprised. He calmly replied, "I am." Ning the Talented looked him up and down. Unexpectedly, she didn't say anything. She only coldly said, "Treat one well." Fan Xian liked this clean and efficient feeling. He happily replied, "Please do not worry, concubine. That incident on Yolan Street must have been strange. I don't believe you could kill an 8th level ace." Ning the Talented looked him up and down and snorted. "Looking at your thin and weak appearance, you don't look like someone who is good at fighting." Fan Xian was startled. Could it be that he had just finished taking an exam in literature, and now he was about to take an exam in martial arts? "But concubine, you are a 40-year-old lady. There is a difference between master and subject, and between men and women. Surely you wouldn't go so far as to beat him with your fists? But since Yilinger admits that she is no match for you, I will have to make do with it. That's all for today. Go to another palace. Don't waste too much time." Having said this, Ning the Talented had nothing else to say. She chased him out of the palace hall. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head and looked at the tightly shut wooden door. He thought to himself, His Majesty really is a lucky man. The women lying by his side are so colorful. There is Yi Guipin, who is the bright and innocent type, Lady Shu, who is the intellectual and virtuous type, and he even has a wild girlfriend like Ning the Talented. But he already knew that Lady Shu was very talented, and that Ning the Talented was probably a person who was rough on the outside, but meticulous on the inside. Add to that the unfathomable Empress, and the fact that His Majesty was able to put all these women in one large room and live in peace for so many years, it had to be said that His Majesty, the Emperor of the Kingdom of Qing, was very powerful. At least, Fan Xian didn't have that kind of ability. Chapter 130. Still walking through the palace, Fan Xian saw a few more ladies, chatted with them, and received a few rewards. He couldn't help but feel a little bored, but he didn't dare show any expression on his face. This was the palace, after all. Who knew whose subordinate the eunuch next to him was, and whose confidant the young serving girl plucking the willow branches was? If his annoyance was seen by these people, then they would whisper it to their masters, and their masters would whisper it to the emperor's pillow. Would he feel any better? Even if he and the emperor were friends who had drunk tea and chatted, he could only suffer a blow without being able to defend himself. But thinking of the people he was going to see, Fan Xian's heart had long since calmed down, and there was even a hint of coldness and cruelty. But when he looked at the palace, his eyes were still full of smiles, as if he was very much looking forward to it. Yaohua Palace was much larger than the other palaces and courtyards, highlighting the identity of its owner. The person who lived here was the Empress of the Kingdom of Qing, the motherly model of the world. Fan Xian had not expected that the Empress summons would end so simply. The Empress smiled warmly, and her words made Fan Xian feel as if he was bathing in a spring breeze. Looking at the Empress' bright and beautiful face, looking at the Empress' eyes that were as calm as water, Fan Xian respectfully responded. His heart was filled with a strange feeling. This elegant and noble woman before him, whose every movement made him feel very comfortable, was actually the person who had wanted to kill him 4 years ago. Kneeling down and kowtowing twice, Fan Xian left Yaohua Palace with a somewhat uneasy expression. His meeting with the Empress had started so simply and ended so hastily. Seeing how well he had concealed his emotions, and even not showing any strange emotions, it could only mean that the Empress looked at Fan Xian without any unease. Fan Xian smiled, the corners of his lips slightly parted, but his heart was cold. Perhaps in the end, he had overestimated his importance. For these nobles in the palace, wanting to kill him 4 years ago was probably a very small matter. Outside the gates of Guangxin Palace, the eunuchs who had followed him carefully moved to the back, not daring to breathe too loudly. The serving girl Xinger was also very conspicuous. In a low voice, she said to Fan Xian, "Master Fan, please come in." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, thinking that if he went in without being summoned, it would be somewhat against the rules. What if he was killed by the eldest princess mother-in-law? Lin Cheng had fallen for the same trick back then, but he knew it wasn't that scary today. These eunuchs and maids were just afraid of the eldest princess for no reason. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui. Her name had a bit of masculinity, but she was a very weak person. Of course, this was just a facade. She had many identities. She was the de facto controller of the palace treasury, the prime minister's old lover, the emperor's most capable political assistant, a transcendent presence in the harem, and the Empress Dowager's most beloved daughter. For Fan Xian, the other party actually only had two identities. One was an enemy who had once wanted to kill him. The second was his future mother-in-law. Guang Xian Palace was cold and gloomy. In broad daylight, the palace doors were naturally not closed. Standing outside the door, one could see some sleeping plum blossoms, heat-averse orchids, old green bamboos, and daisies that had yet to bloom. In the palace, one could see many white muslin curtains fluttering in the wind. The overall feeling was as pure and tender as a fairy tale world. A chill appeared between Fan Xian's brows. It was as if he had been infected by the aura of the palace. A maid in her 20s appeared at the door and bowed slightly to Fan Xian. The maid's eyebrows were extremely long, and her eyes were somewhat cold, but her speech and body movements were still very courteous. She respectfully welcomed Fan Xian into the palace. Muslin. It was all muslin. Fan Xian was a little stunned as he pulled away the white muslin. There were many more muslin curtains in Guang Xian Palace than he had seen in the back garden of King Jing's manor. The decorations around him were also a little strange. It didn't match the solemn atmosphere of the palace. It was more like the living quarters of a young girl waiting to be married. At the end of the heavy curtains was a low bed. A woman in a light pink dress was lying on it. She supported her chin with one arm, and her waist naturally revealed a sense of elegance. Her eyebrows and eyes were picturesque, but her expression was timid and lovable. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his mother-in-law, the eldest princess. Like many people who saw the eldest princess Li Yunrui for the first time, he was dumbfounded. He didn't know if the woman in front of him was real or fake. Was she a figure in a painting or a fairy in the water? The eldest princess was 30 years old, but her demeanor was very much like that of a young girl who had just turned 16. Her eyebrows, and the straight black hair that fell naturally on the arm of the bed, were enough to make any man in the world yearn for her. Fan Xian's face was full of shock, but his strange encounter and the temperament he had trained in Danzhou for 16 years made his mind a sea of calm. But he still had to admit that although his mother-in-law looked like one she was much more beautiful. Although Fan Xian could still maintain his calm, he didn't want to call her mother-in-law in his heart. It seemed that calling her that did not match her natural beauty. The eldest princess looked at Fan Xian. That look contained a lot of meaning. She was timid and lovable. She opened her pale lips and said, "Pick up a chair and sit. I have a headache." Fan Xian looked around uneasily. He realized that the eldest princess had said something unnecessary. In the vast Guangxin Palace, there was not a single chair. As he was puzzled, he heard the eldest princess say softly, "Minister Fan, I hear that you are skilled in medicine. One-Er's health has improved greatly these days. It's all thanks to you." Fan Xian quickly bowed. "Eldest princess is too kind. It's all because of the royal doctor's meticulous care. I'm just giving you a few folk remedies." "Oh." The eldest princess stretched out her slender fingers and rubbed her temples. As her fingertips rubbed, her forehead gradually turned red. "Is there a folk remedy for migraines? I've had a terrible headache these days." The eldest princess had a chronic headache. Fan Xian had heard about this from One-Er. Last time, outside the summer estate, he had heard the crown prince mention it. But Fan Xian paid more attention to how the eldest princess addressed him and how she referred to herself. In their few sentences, the eldest princess referred to him as you and me. It seemed particularly intimate. Fan Xian smiled. "There are many kinds of headaches. When my teacher taught here, he had a headache as well." His words were light, but the two headaches were quite interesting. The eldest princess smiled gently, and her charm grew. Fan Xian knew that his relationship with Fei Jie was no secret in the capital. There was no way he could hide it from the eldest princess, so he made it clear. Is there really no good way? The eldest princess didn't ask about anything else today. Her only concern was the headache. Her face was full of worry, and she looked very weak. These days I've been in so much pain. Fan Xian lowered his eyes slightly and calmed his mind. I've learned a method of massage. Although it can only treat the symptoms and not the root, it has a soothing effect. The eldest princess's eyes brightened. Then hurry and try it, she said softly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I'm afraid it's a little inconvenient. The eldest princess covered her mouth and giggled. I didn't think that the famous great scholar Fan in the capital would be such a polite little scholar. Not to mention that this is an emergency. You'll be my son in a few days. What's there to be afraid of? Fan Xian looked at the eldest princess's youthful demeanor and thought of her true age. He should have felt disgusted, but looking at the eldest princess's tender cheeks and her eyebrows, which were as clear as a young leaf, it was hard to feel disgusted. But hearing the word son, he still laughed coldly in his heart. His face was calm, and he replied, How could I dare disobey the orders of my elders? A eunuch brought a copper basin of clean water. Fan Xian carefully washed his hands and then slowly walked to the eldest princess's side. He took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions. He did his best not to let his gaze fall on the eldest princess's white neck, which was slightly exposed under her black hair. He steadily stretched out his hands and placed them on her head. His fingers ran through the eldest princess's black hair. The tip of her hair floated gently, and there was a slight itch. Fan Xian simply closed his eyes, imagining that he was like Wu Zhu, covered with a black cloth. His fingertips touched the eldest princess's hairline, and then gently moved upwards. His thumbs pressed against her temples, and his two index fingers traced along her eyebrows, confirming the position between her eyebrows. He knocked. The eldest princess seemed unprepared. She gave a light grunt, but it was hard to tell whether it was from pain or from where he had pressed. Fan Xian was calm. Relying on his knowledge of the human body's acupuncture points, he slowly and steadily massaged her head. Every time his fingers made contact with Li Yunrui's skin, it was steady. The Grand Princess frowned, wondering if she had been a little rash. She never thought that this little fellow's technique would be so good. His fingertips seemed to carry a fine stream of air, rubbing the source of her pain. Every time he pressed, it would make her feel much more relaxed. Her mind gradually relaxed, and she seemed to slowly feel sleepy. Did Fei Jie teach you this technique? She asked casually, her eyes half closed as she leaned against the bed. Sir Fei taught me how to recognize acupuncture points. Fan Xian's fingers continued to move steadily across her smooth skin. His voice did not tremble in the slightest. This massage technique, however, was learned by myself. As the saying goes, a long illness makes a doctor. In his previous life, when he was lying on a sickbed, in the beginning, he still had a glimmer of hope that he would be able to stand up again. That was why that cute little nurse often massaged his legs and the muscles of his body. But in the end, he had given up hope. As for the massage technique, Fan Xian remembered it. Not bad. The eldest princess praised him. She slowly closed her eyes again, enjoying the warm and relaxing feeling brought by the young man's hands. Guangxin Palace was silent. The eldest princess's eyes remained closed. Her long eyelashes rested on her fair skin, trembling slightly. She suddenly said, If you want to marry Wan'er, then you must forget what happened 4 years ago. Fan Xian's fingers paused, stopping just below the eldest princess's ear. It seemed ordinary, but it was a fatal acupuncture point. Chapter 131. It was only for a moment, and Fan Xian immediately smiled and began to knead again. His voice, however, was slightly surprised. 4 years ago, the eldest princess smiled, and the corners of her lips arched into a beautiful curve. She seemed to be secretly admiring this young man. She changed the subject. When did Fei Jie start teaching you? Fan Xian knew that she was testing him. His expression did not change, and he calmly replied, "That was when I was young." His words were very vague, and the eldest princess could not ask for too much detail due to her status. She said with a faint smile, "If I did not know that Fei Jie was your teacher, I think many people in the palace, including those in the palace, would not know that the Fan family has such a close relationship with the Overwatch Council." Fan Xian's hands became gentler, and his reply became more careful. "I'm not very sure. Perhaps father and Fei Jian knew each other in the past." The eldest princess gently said, "Of course they knew each other. During the first northern expedition, your father and Fei Jie were both with the emperor in the army tent. It would be strange to say that they did not know each other. But I was very young back then, so it is even more impossible for you to know about these things." Yes, Fan Xian knew that the more he said, the more likely he would be to slip up. He smiled and said nothing more. The eldest princess seemed to be in the mood for conversation. She continued to ask, "How is her grandmother?" "She's in good health." "Yes, I have not seen her in a long time," the eldest princess replied weakly. "When I was young, I liked your grandmother the most. Every time my brother wanted to bully me, she was the one who protected me." Fan Xian smiled and thought, "If grandmother knew that you wanted to kill me now, I am afraid she would have taken a wooden stick and beaten you to death. I believe that Sir Fan should have explained His Majesty's intentions clearly to you." The eldest princess's sweet and gentle words suddenly brought up such a serious topic. Comparing the two, it was especially cold. Fan Xian's brows furrowed imperceptibly. He knew that she was talking about the matter of the palace treasury. At this time, he could no longer play dumb. All he could do was smile and say, "I will follow His Majesty's arrangements." "Oh, I heard that you recently opened a bookstore and a tofu shop in the capital." The eldest princess could not help but smile. With her eyes closed, her smile was as beautiful as ever. The children of aristocratic families are mostly useless people who only know how to talk and do nothing. I admire you for being able to enter this line of work in preparation for taking over the palace treasury in the future. It's just that the matter of the tofu shop was a bit too much. Fan Xian chuckled, not knowing how to deal with it. "Actually, I want to kill you." The atmosphere, which had just seemed to have become more harmonious, immediately turned into the cold night of the Qing kingdom's northern border because of the eldest princess' cold words with a smile on her face. It froze everything in Guangxin Palace. The warm white gauze fluttering around them also drooped down weakly. Fan Xian maintained his gentle smile, but he moved his right foot back 2 inches, assuming the position where it was easiest to exert force. The Overwatch Council had long discovered the relationship between Wu Bowen and this woman. Since this woman had already tried to kill him twice, it would not be impossible for her to do it a third time in Guangxin Palace, which was filled with hidden murderous intent. Of course, everyone in the capital knew that he had entered the palace. Logically speaking, no one would be crazy enough to try to kill him in the palace. But after entering Guangxin Palace, seeing the eldest princess' childish demeanor and tone of voice, Fan Xian felt an inexplicable chill in his heart. This woman seemed to be crazy. He was now massaging the eldest princess' head. Although it was her request, and he was going to marry her daughter, there was a difference between a man and a woman. What if this woman casually used the crime of flirting with the princess and incestuous to send people to kill him? What could the people behind him do? They would not be able to save him in time. Fan Xian knew that the truly terrifying things in this world were children, women, and crazy people, because these 3 types of people could not be judged or analyzed rationally. At any time, they could do something crazy with serious consequences. And in Fan Xian's eyes, this extremely beautiful young woman under his command was, without a doubt, a combination of these 3 poisons. She was a clear-minded and ruthless woman, but her actions were childish and her methods were crazy. She made up the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, who was different from the others and particularly terrifying. At this moment, a few serving girls walked into the palace. They wore light pomegranate-colored, tight-fitting serving girl robes that showed off their curves, but were very convenient to attack. Their belts were a bit thick, and Fan Xian, who had immersed himself in the art of assassination for 10 years in Danzhou, could immediately see that within those belts were extremely sharp swords. But his fingers continued to steadily rub the soft skin under the eldest princess' ear. With a face full of smiles, he said, "Princess, why do you want to kill me? Many people think I have a reason to kill you, and it is a very good reason." The eldest princess' eyes were still closed, as if she was not at all afraid that Fan Xian would suddenly counterattack and kill her under his fingers. Fan Xian lowered his head and did not reply. It was as if he was concentrating all of his attention on his fingers. Actually, his eyes were tightly closed up until now. Guangxin Palace was so quiet that even a ghost cat could be heard walking by. A few serving girls slowly moved closer to the eldest princess' side. Fan Xian's eyes were closed, but his head was slightly tilted to the right. "Master Fan, please clean your hands." Who knew where the serving girls came from? But the serving girls brought warm water and towels. Fan Xian opened his eyes and bowed to the eldest princess. He smiled and thanked the serving girls. He soaked his somewhat numb hands in the warm water and wiped them clean with a towel. He bowed all the way to the ground. "Does your highness feel better?" The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. There was still a trace of timidity in her soft eyes, but Fan Xian knew that this woman was definitely one of the most terrifying people in the world. "Much better." The eldest princess slowly straightened her body and tidied her black hair. She lowered her head and said gently, "I did not think that the husband that one is about to marry would have such a good skill. To tell the truth, I am a little reluctant to part with you." Fan Xian stood respectfully and quietly at the lower end, not daring to say anything more. He knew that when faced with such a woman, no matter what he said, it would create a difficult result to analyze. Thus, he might as well play the trick of not saying 1,000 words as one. "You go. I'm a little tired." The eldest princess's lips bloomed like a flower. She said softly, "Tell Sister Lu that she did not come to see me today. I am very disappointed." After Fan Xian respectfully left Guangxin Palace, the eldest princess trusted serving girl walked to her side and quietly asked, "Princess, should we kill him? I was just playing with a child. Otherwise, life in the palace would be really boring." The eldest princess stretched like a cat. She was very lazy and very seductive. "This young man is really beyond my expectations. He's like a person in his 30s or 40s. He is very tolerant and very good at hiding." The eldest princess did not have any intention of killing him at first, but seeing Fan Xian's every step of defense and not a single flaw, this wonderful woman, who saw fighting as a game, gradually began to itch in her heart. Given her position in the palace and the perverted mentality that even Fan Xian could think of, if Fan Xian actually lost focus for a moment, she would probably give the order to kill him. Her gaze glanced at the palace door that was faintly visible through the layers of white gauze. A strange smile rose to the corners of her lips. She thought to herself, "In the instant you were about to attack, you slightly tilted your head. What did that mean? I'm truly curious. Fan Xian, how did you grow up? What a pity." He didn't know what this woman was feeling sorry for. Perhaps it was for the danger that Fan Xian would face in a few days. Fan Xian grew up playing with poisons, so he realized that the eldest princess was a rare and powerful poison. She was a difficult character for him to deal with. Leaving Guangxin Palace, he looked expressionlessly at the dozing palace maid Xing, and said coldly, "Let's go back." He then walked toward Yi Guiping's palace. Surprisingly, he didn't go the wrong way. Only now did Xing realize that Master Fan's back was already wet with sweat. His light blue robe had a dark mark on it. He looked very wretched. Leaving the palace, Fan Xian boarded the carriage waiting at the far end of the square. His face was a little pale. His hand rested on his abdomen and pressed on the pill in his belt. He laughed at himself, not knowing whether he was a careful thinker or a coward. If the eldest princess really wanted to kill him, why would she choose Guangxin Palace? "Are you all right?" Fan Ro looked at her brother sympathetically. She had no idea how tiring his conversation in Guangxin Palace had been. She thought he was just tired from going around visiting the Empress. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. He relayed to Lady Lu the greetings that the Empress had asked him to pass on. He then urged the carriage to hurry back to the manor. Lady Lu and Fan Ro looked at him curiously. They didn't understand why he was in such a hurry. The carriage drove into a side alley next to Fan Manor. Fan Xian excused himself to Lady Lu, then took his sister's slightly cold hand and rushed to the back garden. After a short while, they were in the study. Fan Ro pressed on her heaving chest and said breathlessly, "Brother, what are you doing? You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."